Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Protect Our Kids 2021. I'm Pastor Bob. If it's your first time here, we welcome you to Calvary Chapel, East Anaheim. We want to begin by invoking the name of Jesus Christ on our meeting, so would you stand with me as I open us in a word of prayer. Father, I thank you for what you intend to do tonight. We thank you that you have a plan to instruct us. You said it is not good to be without knowledge, and we are here to tell you we want to know and understand all that we need to so that we can be effective as parents and teachers and educators and as believers in this community, Lord. So we commit the night to you. We pray you do great things with it. In Jesus' name, amen. You can have a seat. Thank you for coming. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to share a scripture that we use all the time at our church when we dedicate children. So it's familiar probably to you. It says, "Behold, children are a gift of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full." God describes children, especially the children of our youth, like arrows. And I've heard it said, and I like this analogy, that's true, that in the ancient world you didn't go down to some sporting goods place to buy your arrows. If you were a warrior, you had to probably shape them and form them and make them yourself. And it's true, God has given us children who are very vulnerable, and he wants us to see them as our most precious gifts and stewardship from him. We're going to be accountable for how we treat really his children, because they're ours for a season in this life, and then for eternity, they're the Lord's. But like an arrow, an arrow has to be shaped and formed and balanced. There's an ultimate goal of taking that arrow and, of course, getting it into the launch pad of a bow. If you think about a child and their growth, there comes a point where an arrow has to be aimed and held in tension. That's called adolescence, by the way. But then eventually, and everyone who's had a child leave their home or as an empty nester, there's that moment of release where your job in a very real way is substantially done. Very hard to control an arrow after it's gone, but you have that time. But it's interesting, God says that they are in a quiver. The children of our youth are in a quiver, close to us in a place of protection. Here's what Jesus said in the New Testament regarding children. "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him that a heavy millstone be hung around his neck and that he be drowned in the depth of the sea." In other words, huge accountability for our children and what we do with them. So I, with all my heart, am so grateful for Mark and the others that will be speaking to us tonight to help educate us, because so many people, when we share with them what's going on in our culture and in our schools, don't believe it. I think you will tonight. So thank you for taking the time to come on a long weekend and a hot weekend. I'm glad that you're here. Mark Schneider, besides being my friend, is the founder and the president of POK. He's a native Californian, spent most of his career in Silicon Valley, serving as corporate counsel and in executive positions at several large technology companies before going into private practice as a patent litigator. In response to California's Prop 8, which fought to preserve traditional marriage, this is when I first met Mark, he founded our Salt Light ministry here at the church. Mark received his Bachelor of Science in Electrical and Electronics Engineering at Cal Poly Pomona, Juris Doctorate from Trinity Law School. In addition to his work leading Protect Our Kids, Mark has published law review booklets and articles that touch on the intersection of theology and law. And he's married to Kathy and has 2 adult homeschooled children, Eric and Julia, and I couldn't be more proud to introduce to you Mark Schneider. Would you come? Give him a welcome. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Pastor Bob. And more importantly, it's just as importantly, thank you for in-person attendees and also those who are attending online. Thank you for giving up your Sunday night to hear what we think is very important information. It's written in Hosea that the people perish for lack of knowledge. And what we hope to do this evening is to impart to you what we think is very important information about what is going on in our public school system, what we term the triple threat. But before we begin, a few logistics. Here's the schedule for tonight. I don't know if this was pre-printed. You're probably wondering, well, how long is this going to go on? And we hope to be done in 3 to 4 hours. We're going to go for a couple of hours before a formal break, whereupon we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and have a panel discussion. So I hope you will stay around for that. That will give you an opportunity to ask all the questions that you are undoubtedly going to have. And so that is the schedule. So to ask your questions, we're going to be doing something a little bit different than what we've done in the past. You're going to use your smartphone devices. So what you want to do is just text your question, whatever it is, to this number. We will collect them at the break and try to do our best with our panel to answer your questions. So before I introduce our first speaker, I want to give you a little bit of background information, a little context, if you will. Because today, in terms of dollars per student spent, the US outspends virtually every nation on earth in terms of public education. But for all our money, studies like this one from the Pew Foundation, measuring math, science, and reading, put us in the middle to bottom rungs of academic performance compared to other nations, most of which spend far less than we do per student. And California places lower still compared to the sub-average US performance. Because while our universities are still able to compete in K through 12, we rank in the bottom 20%. In fact, according to the Literacy Project, 45 million Americans are functionally illiterate, unable to read above the 5th grade level, and half of all adults can't read a book at an 8th grade level. That's shocking in the United States of America. In California, 25% of the state's 6 million students are unable to perform basic reading skills. Now, of course, the argument is, well, we just need to spend more money on public education. That's the problem. We need to throw more money at the problem. But that really doesn't wash, because prior to compulsory public education, which happened in the mid-19th century, literacy rates were 90% compared to 75% today. And it's not as if the failures of our public schools have taken us by surprise. Way back in 1983, a now famous report came out entitled "A Nation at Risk" that warned of a rising tide of mediocrity in our public schools that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. That was nearly 40 years ago. So the obvious question is, if our schools aren't focused on basic literacy in the 3 R's, what are they focused on? Well, it's not a mystery. 34 years ago, the University of Chicago professor Alan Bloom declared in his now famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, there is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, the truth is relative. He then went on to chronicle the radical secularization that was happening in the public schools. Why is this important? Well, as Abraham Lincoln warned, the philosophy in the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. What Lincoln understood, and what we must, is that politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from people's beliefs and worldview. For most of America's history, the worldview that was presented in our nation's classroom was based on a Judeo-Christian model, Jerusalem plus Athens. But beginning in the last century, the biblical worldview in public came under unprecedented attack. In 1962, in the case of Engel versus Vitale, we removed prayer from our public schools. 1 year later, in 1963, in the case of Abington School District versus Shemp, Bible reading was removed from our schools. So it's no mystery how we've arrived at the state of affairs we are today. What is the triple threat? It includes these three things: comprehensive sexuality education, critical race theory, and what we term historical revisionism. And to talk about the first threat, I want to invite Pastor George Rosca Jr. to come to the stage. I had the good fortune of meeting George about 2.5 years ago when we first started to gear up for this fight. Turns out George had been in the fight longer than I have. And I want to tell you a little bit about him. George is the 8th of 12 children born in Romania under the communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu. His family immigrated to the United States legally in 1991. He grew up in Southern California and lives in Orange currently with his wife and 4 children. He pastors New Hope Church in Placentia. He holds a bachelor's in civil engineering and an MBA from California Polytechnic University. As a registered civil engineer in the state of California, George leads diverse teams on large transportation infrastructure projects. George is also a founding member of POK. He is on our board, and George and I are colleagues in arms in this fight to protect our kids. So please welcome George Rosca.
Thank you. I think the applause was for my parents who had 12 children, not for me. I don't want to take credit for any of that. After 4, we're like, seems like a good number. It's my least favorite topic in the world to talk about, comprehensive sexuality education. I want to run through just a quick agenda so you can get an understanding of how I'm going to be tying all of this together. First of all, I want to introduce you to the worldview behind all of this, followed by the definitions. So terms and definitions are going to be critical. Third, we're going to dive into a little bit of the history of how we got here legally in terms of the laws that affect us. Then we'll look at the law AB 329 here in the state of California. And then we'll go into some of the examples. And then we'll look at the evidence. Is comprehensive sexuality education really viable? What does the evidence show? It's been around in school now for quite some time, and we could look at its effects and study it. And so we're going to see, is it really a good thing or not? So first of all, the worldview. For us to be able to understand what comprehensive sexuality education is all about, we have to understand that it stems from the critical theory worldview, which categorizes everybody into an oppressor or an oppressed category. So when it comes to comprehensive sexuality education, think of it like our threat number 2, which is critical race theory. The other side kind of gave it away when they finally came out with critical race theory. With comprehensive sexuality education, it was very elusive. So think of CSE as comprehensive or critical sex theory, not CSE, okay? Critical sex theory. Now, I'll allude to this over and over. So who are the oppressed category? Well, it's the hetero people, the heteronormative people, as you'll see them called. And who are the oppressed? Well, it's the entire alphabet soup label of LGBTQ+. Parents, shockingly, parents are part of the oppressor category. Children or kids are part of the oppressed category. So let me show you how it works. GELSN, Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, a very powerful organization that's been around in the U.S. since 1990 with a sole focus on setting up gay-straight alliance clubs on high school campuses, tweeted this back in 2016, why heteronormativity is a bad thing. And they linked an article in their tweet from Teen Vogue, which is focused on 13 to 17-year-old girls. It's about time we kicked heteronormativity to the curb. Never heard of the term before? It's the idea that binary gender identity and heterosexual orientation, meaning there are only 2 sexual orientations and genders, are the norm. Heteronormative people like you and I, we are the oppressors, and we need to get rid of this norm. SIECUS, the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States, a very pompous, self-given title because they are not a federal organization. You're going to see this over and over. These organizations like to give themselves very cool names, but they're not official by any means. Out of their 2018 Sex Ed Mid-Year Report, what they do is every year, twice a year, they have a mid-year report and an end-year report. They look at all 50 states and they analyze the laws that are going through the state legislature. Here's a little commentary they give in on opt-in policies. They say, parent or guardian engagement in sexual education can be important. Can is the operative word. Isn't it? Is important? So check this out. Part of ensuring young people have trusted sources of information related to their sexuality. So you mean parents are not trusted sources of information for children's sexuality? Unfortunately, and this is where it goes south, requiring written consent from parents or guardians in order for students to participate in sexuality-related instruction, an opt-in provision, undermines the rights of the student to gain knowledge from a trusted and qualified educator. I'm sorry, parents, you don't check those boxes. You are not a trusted and qualified educator. You see the worldview behind this. Oppressor, oppressed. So I mentioned now, let's see how this worldview permeates definitions. Because growing up here in the United States of America, I had sex ed. We all called it that. But it's not called sex ed anymore. It's sexuality education. So let's look at what the word sexuality is defined to mean, which, by the way, Planned Parenthood divided in a big study they put out called the Comprehensive Sexuality Education Guideline, published in 2006. With that, they went to the World Health Organization in 2006 and asked the WHO to change their definition of sexuality. Sexuality, a central aspect of being human throughout life, encompasses, check this out, sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy, and reproduction, thoughts, fantasies, desires, beliefs, attitude, values, behaviors. I didn't include the entire definition. So when we are being told that our kids are receiving comprehensive sexuality education, we think, oh, it's just sex ed. It is not. And so when then you start looking at the curricula and you start seeing, well, why are they teaching about thoughts and fantasies and pleasure and consent? The law doesn't say anything about that, but the law says comprehensive sexuality education. Aha, they caught you right there because they changed the definition without any one of us knowing. So that's very important. Another important definition to understand is sexual rights. Remember the quote we just read on opt-in policies, undermining the rights of the child? Where does this whole concept of children having sexual rights come from? Planned Parenthood, 2 years later in 2008, after they developed their whole guidelines on CSE, they came out with a guideline titled Sexual Rights, an IPPF declaration. IPPF stands for the International Planned Parenthood Federation. It's the global arm of Planned Parenthood, which, by the way, Planned Parenthood is in over 140 countries in this world. They have a lot of power and influence. So what are sexual rights? Check this out. This is the scary part. Again, back to critical theory and the worldview that emanates from this. Sexual rights are human rights related to sexuality. Well, I think we all know what human rights are, right? We've fought world wars over them. And thank you, America, for coming to save us. Because if not, I'd probably be speaking German right now. Nothing against the German people. It's just what happened in World War II. But do you understand the consequence of equating sexual rights to human rights? Because in a Marxist state and in a Marxist critical theory worldview, children don't belong to parents. Children belong to the state. And so if I violate my child's rights, if I violate their sexual rights, which equals human rights, I've committed something atrocious. And now, what happens? The state has every right and obligation to come consequences, right? So what is included in this whole sexual rights? Well, there are 10 sexual rights in this declaration. Some of them are abortion, sex work, which is, again, a new term for prostitution, pleasure, consent, sex change, and education, specifically comprehensive sexuality education. So now you understand why opt-in policies are so oppressive to our children, right? And diversity of family forms, heteronormativity. Kick that to the curb. We need to bring in everything. You could see this kind of spewing in what the themes are of all of these organizations. SECUS has as their motto, sex ed is a vehicle for social change, full stop. Wait up, but I thought it was just teaching kids about their human reproductive organs. No. In a critical theory Marxist worldview, it's never about that. The end game is always social change. And now all of these organizations that we thought are just teaching our children sex education are in fact infiltrating them with critical theory about social change. Let's look at the same terminology about social change. Planned Parenthood. On their website, Sex and Relationships. We're going to take a gender transformative approach. That sounds so beautiful, right? CSE, based on a gender transformative approach, seeks to foster equitable social norms. See the social stuff coming on? And structures, advance personal gender equitable behavior, transform gender roles, create more gender equitable relationships, and engage participants in efforts to change existing policy and legislation to support equitable social systems. They can't get away from this word social. It's all out there in the open. Other organizations that you'll see, Advocates for Youth, the Future of Sex Ed, they will talk about these terminologies: social, racial, and reproductive justice and equity, intersectionality, language inclusivity, and everything comes back to changing an entire society. So CSE, as a worldview, has 4 very definable goals. Number 1, it's to advance the sexual orientation, gender identity, ideology, in all public education. It denies biological reality and objective truth. You heard Mark mention, Professor Bloom, 1980, all truth is relative. 41 years later, we're experiencing the consequences of such a relativistic moral framework. Third, it sexualizes children at the earliest age possible. Why? Because it's their sexual right. And how dare you as a parent oppress your child by not allowing them to have access to a qualified and trusted educator that will give them CSE. And it undermines parental authority. So let's look at some of the laws just here in the state of California over the last 20 years. There's a bunch of them, but I'll just point out here a few. Over on the right-hand column, Title V Education Code, beloved Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, 2004, changed the definition of gender to include one's perceived identity. 2004, these were already being changed in our law books. I barely graduated high school the year before. Let's go on in 2011, SB 48, left column, Brown, 2011, Fair Education Act. This imposed the teaching of LGBTQ people in our history books and to promote them and to talk about them. Not about the great things they did, just the fact that they were LGBTQ. AB 1266, Brown 2013, the infamous bathroom bill. Parents, if you open up your parent handbook from your local school district that they send you every single year, it's probably somewhere between like 60 to 80 pages long, but they're usually in PDF format. Just do a quick search for bathroom And it'll take you to the appropriate sections, and you will see there that any child can choose to go to any bathroom of their choice on any given day. They can change. Tomorrow they can go and use the girls' restroom. The day after that they can choose to use the boys' restroom. And guess what? They are not allowed to be questioned by any of the staff because of this law. AB 329, which we'll talk about a little bit right now, and then AB 2119 in 2018, which took AB 329, comprehensive sexuality education, which was mandated in public schools, and now it became mandated in charter schools as well. I also want to point out, besides law, we have court cases. And this is one of the most infamous court cases that the ACLU and Planned Parenthood, whenever they see like a parent uprising in a certain school district, they'll send the representatives there. And usually beforehand, the ACLU will send a letter to the board members. And they say, we want to remind you that in Fields versus Palmdale, here's what the Ninth Circuit Court said. They said, we hold that there is no freestanding fundamental right of parents to control the upbringing of their children by introducing them to matters of and relating to sex in accordance with their personal and religious values and beliefs. Parents are possessed of no constitutional right to prevent the public schools from providing information on that subject to their students in any forum or manner they select. This is in the United States of America. And lastly, they say, in sum, we affirm that the Meyer-Pierce right of parents to control the upbringing of their children does not extend beyond the threshold of the school door. This is precedent. This is in our laws right now. Can you imagine? This is the way that the Ninth Circuit Court feels about me and you, parents. So let's talk about the California Unhealthy Youth Act. So it encompasses Education Codes 51930 to 51939. It's not a long read, about 4 pages. And one of the speakers tonight, who is a lawyer, will go and dive into some of the details. But I just want to point out a couple interesting things as then we get into the curricular examples. Schools shall provide CSE for ages 7 through 12. Schools may provide CSE for K through 6th grade. So if you have a teacher, a rogue superintendent who just wants to bring in all of this information in, they may, even from kindergarten up. Schools shall affirm homosexuality and subjective gender identities. And guess what? There's no more opt-in, meaning that you get a permission slip home, and if you as a parent don't sign it or just happen to have lost it, that child is not going to go into that classroom until the teacher has received that permission for him. No, now it's the other way around. If you don't sign it, they automatically go into that classroom, and they're going to be taught all of this stuff. So it's the beginning of the school year. If you haven't seen such a form, please call up your local, your front office, and ask for that form so you can opt them out. And if you need a sample opt-out form, you can go to our website at www.protectourkidsnow.org. We have all of those forms available for you. So we have the law, we have curriculum, but we have also something very interesting called the framework. So when the law passes, the state legislature, in 4 pages, is trying to tell the education system what to do, right? Not a lot of detail. So then the State Department of Education takes that law and interprets it, and it took them over 700 pages to interpret AB 329. It's not good reading material at night because it makes your blood boil, guys. So you won't fall asleep. And then curricula, by the curricula developers, has to be developed in compliance with this framework and submitted to the Adolescent Sexual Health Work Group in order for it to be approved, to say, yes, you checked all the boxes, it meets AB 329, it's in compliance. So there are 5 middle school curriculums and 6 high school curriculums that are approved. They're up there on that list for you. So let's dive in and see what the evidence really shows us. We're going to see that there is no parental consent required. We're going to see that it normalizes anal and oral sex. There's an obsessive focus on sexual pleasure. It promotes and encourages exploration, experimentation, and a bunch of other things. So to start off right from the earliest age possible, remember the gingerbread man? They've redefined that too. It's the genderbread person, right? We got to be equitable. We got to use, gender inclusive words. So your identity is here in your brain, and it's on a spectrum, and they just list 5 of the things that are possible, but it's endless. They say it's infinite. Then you have your attraction. It's in your heart. That's your sexual orientation. Then you have your biological sex, which, oh, by the way, it's also on a spectrum, so unscientific. We know by chromosomes there's only 2 biological sexes. And then there is the expression on the outside, how you choose to dress, more masculine, more feminine. This is what they're teaching from kindergarten onwards. In that 700-page framework, there's a chapter each for various grades. So for kindergarten through 3rd grade, they have a big, long chapter. They give them examples of what kind of books teachers can start introducing to their kids. And I'm going to show you examples from these books. Same thing from 4th through 6th grade. Some people say there are only 2 genders, but there are really many genders. There are just a few words people use. Trans, gender queer, non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, gender neutral. This is for K through 3rd grade. I mean, I'm stumped. I remember when I read this first time, what is this? What is gender queer? Like, how is that different from just being queer? It's crazy. Did you check out that last one, Two-Spirit? K through 3rd grade. It's not The Stork, one of those books. It dramatizes an erect penis. We covered all of this for you, but our kids get to see it, all right? And it labels, I'm not going to read those words there. You can read them for yourself. I'm sorry. Some more discussion about masturbation, teaching them what happens during puberty. This one says, when all else fails, you have to learn how to use a dental dam, because it's a protective barrier. I'll let you figure that out on your own. It's sickening. It's to be used for anal or oral sex or other things. In the health framework for 7th through 8th grade, in this chapter, quote, they define what spiritual abuse means, and they state this: examples for spiritual abuse include using religion to justify abuse, insisting on rigid gender roles. If we claim gender is not on an infinite spectrum, but there's just 2, you are spiritually abusing your children. And oh, by the way, the state of California has now become the Church of California, right? I thought we had separation of church and state. Not when it doesn't work in their favor. Fun fact, since the anus is not part of the reproductive system, if someone chooses to have anal sex without a condom/protection, pregnancy would not be possible, is what they want to teach your daughters and my daughter. That's a fun fact. That's out of Be Real, Be Ready, Lesson 13. It's one of the approved curriculums. Then in 9th through 12th grade, they want your children to know that there is an organization called the ACLU, which stands for the American Communist Lawyers Network. And what they will teach you is how to go, without parental consent or notification, go to an abortion clinic and get an abortion. Or nowadays, it's even providing sex hormones if you want to start transitioning. Yes, they teach you. So now let's examine the best of the best evidence that we have that these studies, if CSC is actually what it says it is, then it must be doing something good, right? Like teenage pregnancies should be just like minimal. STIs should be dropping. AIDS should be eradicated, right? All of these stuff, right? So we have to let the other side give us their best evidence. So I searched for that. And here is one of their best organizations called UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Education Cultural Organization. They wrote this thing called International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. You know what? My parents knew how to have 12 kids without international technical guidance on sexuality education. We grew up in a town of like 300 people, so we had no sex ed, all right? Our parents gave it to us. They says this, quote, this is page 28 of 142. I found it after reading through 142 pages. Don't ask me why I like to read this stuff. It is difficult to draw strong conclusions about the impact of CSE on biological outcomes, such as STIs or HIV rates, as there are still relatively few high-quality trials available, particularly those that take a longitudinal approach. Now, the first thing when I read this, I'm like, this is 2018. Our law was passed in 2015. So what evidence did they have in 2015 to pass this law if 3 years later they still didn't have evidence that it works? Do you see how crazy this stuff is? Abigail Schreier, if you don't know this lady, oh my goodness, this lady wrote a phenomenal book called Irreversible Damage. If you want to just look at the transgender craze, so just the T part of this movement, you have to read this book. Basically, what's happened just in the last decade is if in all of documented history in the past, gender dysphoria affected a minute part of our population, overwhelmingly boys, in the last 10 years, that has flipped to a ginormous part of our population, overwhelmingly girls. Something like that doesn't just happen coincidentally. There is something working in the background. Please pick up that book. I mentioned that STIs, STDs, they are nowhere close to being low. They are actually going out through the roof. Gonorrhea, up 56% from 2015 since this law was passed. Syphilis, up 74% since 2015. So where are they getting their evidence from? Here is another really good report that I want you to read. It's called Re-Examining the Evidence for Comprehensive Sexuality Education in Schools. It was written by Dr. Stan Weed, a gentleman who has been in this space for over 40 years analyzing sex education, and his assistant, Irene Erickson. And they came up in 2017 and 2018 with two reports that analyzed 60 studies here in the United States and an additional 43 studies globally outside of the United States. And out of these 103 studies, only 6% of these studies were found to show evidence in some categories of effectiveness by CSE curricula. Isn't that crazy? So then, the conspiracy theorist that I am, with all this evidence in front of me, I have to draw a conclusion, right? So what is the conclusion? Who is after your kids? Who is after my kids? My oldest sister told me, George, something changed in you when your little girl was born in 2017. I have one girl and 3 boys. And when I first stumbled on comprehensive sexuality education in April of 2018, and I was holding this tiny little precious 8-month-old girl with a little bow on her head that I would always put every day. I love that. So cute and adorable. I said, the war is on. And every day since then, I will not stop until CSE is eradicated, not just from America, but from the face of planet Earth. God bless you.
George will be back. Those books you mentioned, by the way, we have a few copies, a few examples of those at our back table, so I encourage you to go and take a look. If you don't believe us, you can believe the evidence itself. What George gave you in the last 30 minutes or so is just a smattering of what is actually there regarding this topic around comprehensive sexuality education. We used to give 3-hour conferences just covering this one topic. So I hope that you will take the time to further investigate this matter because it will be well worth your time. The reason why we can't give a 3-hour conference on this topic tonight is because there are 2 other threats now that our children are facing in the public school system. The next one being critical race theory. Who has not heard that term in this audience? I'm not surprised. It's been all over the news recently. Parents, if there's been one silver lining to the COVID virus, it's that many parents have been able to look over the shoulders of their children as they're taking classes via Zoom and actually seeing what's being presented to them. And of course, when they see CRT, they are apoplectic. So from Loudoun County to California, we see school boards being inundated with angry parents saying, "What are you teaching our kids?" But what is critical race theory? How do you define it? Well, here's an encyclopedia definition. Critical race theory is an intellectual movement based on the premise that race is a socially constructed category to oppress and exploit people of color. Okay, well, let's unpack that a little bit, because having analyzed CRT over the last year, if you look at all of the curriculums, we have been able to discover a number of common themes, common elements, and I'd like to go through those with you now. The first one is that race is the primary human characteristic in life. So in the biblical worldview, and we learn this from Genesis 1 and 2, mankind, male and female, are created imago Dei, in the image of God. And because of that, we have inherent worth and dignity. And this is expanded on in the New Testament, where even economic, ethnic, and gender differences are insignificant compared to with our identity in Christ, the value that we get for being in Christ. CRT does completely away with this thinking. Because it's a byproduct of materialism, they arbitrarily place race at the center of human identity. It is your defining characteristic. Number 2, the Marxist class struggle is still with us, but the labels have changed. Instead of bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, the class warfare now is between, as George mentioned, oppressors and oppressed. The struggle now is racial, not necessarily economic. Although it is economic, it's more racial. 3, if you're light-skinned, you are inherently racist. Your denial of that fact only proves it so, which means that your very nature violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the 1964 Civil Rights Law. But by contrast, under CRT, people of color cannot be racist. This is an evidence slide presented in a CRT-related case in Nevada that was being taught in the charter school there. And you can see from the slide, the teachers were telling this particular student that racism equals prejudice plus power. Therefore, since people of color have no power, they cannot be racist. Number 4, American society obviously is systemically racist and therefore systemically corrupt. Fine-tuning it is not going to work. It needs to be reconstructed as a matter of first principles. Those first principles, of course, coming from critical race theory. Next, the degree of one's oppression is a function of your intersectionality, which is a mask term for identity victimhood. This is one of many graphics used to identify your intersecting victim identities. Are you a white female but lesbian? Well, congratulations, you're one of the oppressed. Do you happen to be a black female and you're lesbian? You're even more oppressed. That's the idea behind intersectionality. But there are definite benefits of being oppressed, because under CRT and the concept of intersectionality, the more victim categories that you can self-identify with, the more moral authority that you have, and the less responsibility for any personal or societal shortcomings. Number 6, knowledge is socially constructed. It's a function of power structures defined by the powerful for the purpose of keeping the oppressed in check. The French philosopher Michel Foucault is a leading light in CRT circles for this particular idea. Even scientific knowledge based on empirical data is subject to social concerns. And finally, liberal democracy and capitalism are both illegitimate because both were founded on racism and oppression. Ibram X. Kendi is one of the leading lights in CRT circles. He's a Boston University professor. And in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he states that capitalism and racism are conjoined twins, two sides of the same destructive body. Now, while there are many other aspects to CRT, these 7 features provide a good summary. But where did CRT come from, and why are we suddenly having to contend with it in our public schools? Well, to answer that question requires that we do a little bit of history, starting in the 19th century. You may recognize these pictures because CRT is actually derivative, as George mentioned, of an older philosophy known as critical theory that goes back to Marx and Hegel. Marx, of course, filtered life in terms of the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. He believed in the inevitability of economic class warfare in Western society. Hegel went a little deeper. All knowledge, he taught, is a function of social conventions and interdependencies. He summarily rejected the founders' idea of self-evident truths as expressed in the Declaration of Independence and its inalienable rights. But these ideas did not die with Hegel and Marx, far from it. Men like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer started what's known today as the Frankfurt School in Germany during the Weimar Republic in the late 1920s and 30s. Originally known as the Institute of Marxism, the founders changed it to the Institute of Social Research in light of the bad rap that Marx was getting because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And it eventually became known just as the Frankfurt School because of its city of origin. It was here that the terms critical theory and deconstructionism began to really take root. Another name, Herbert Marcuse, was one of its most powerful and influential voices. But Germans were not the only ones to sign on to the Frankfurt School. The famous Italian Antonio Gramsci had a particularly powerful influence. Marx's prediction that the West would inevitably collapse in economic class warfare never materialized. In fact, societies even loosely based on a biblical worldview prospered beyond their imagining. So Gramsci and others came to believe that if Marxism was ever to succeed in toppling Western society, it would have to come not through what he called a war of movement, actual war, but a war of position. We would have to infiltrate the West's most critical structures, higher academia, centers of media, commerce, churches, and of course, primary and secondary education. And then after a period of decades, not only would be people willing to give to a system of more centralized control, they would demand it. As Gramsci himself put it, any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot be overthrown until those roots are cut. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the New World Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. Sound familiar? Well, with the rise of Nazism in Germany, the members of the Frankfurt School were looking for an escape, and they found one at Columbia University in 1934. And the man who brought the Frankfurt School to Columbia was John Dewey. John Dewey was a Fabian socialist. The Fabians also believed that socialism would take decades to topple Western society. Dewey was also the signer of the first Humanist Manifesto. Well, the Frankfurt School may be long gone. These guys are all dead and gone, but its disciples are still around us today, like Richard Delgado, Gene Stefanik. Delgado advocates for jury nullification to remedy racial wrongs and ethnic identification over American unity. Or how about Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility? DiAngelo believes that individualism is corrosive and that Western education is, quote, the belly of the beast. Already mentioned has been Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. Then there's Kimberly Crenshaw and Cheryl Harris, authors of the forthcoming book Intersectionality. They wrote, it's not about supplication, it's about power. It's not about asking, it's about demanding. It's not about convincing those who are currently in power, it's about changing the very face of power itself. And finally, Patricia Coolers and Alicia Garza. They're the founders of the Black Lives Matter, BLM. In a video interview, Coolers proudly declared that both she and BLM co-founder Garza were trained Marxist. But you may have heard that Patricia Coolers is not part of the Black Lives movement anymore because it turns out she's quite an inspired capitalist. She has many multi-million-dollar homes, including one in Topanga Canyon, which she put a wall around to protect her property from others that wanted to get in. I guess hypocrisy will only go so far. So these are some of the features and some of the people behind CRT. But why should we be concerned about this? It's fairly academic stuff that I've just reviewed. Because the goals of CRT are also its harms. CRT divides versus unites. And the Gospels were warned that a house divided cannot stand, but that's precisely the goal of CRT. One of the founding values of America is e pluribus unum. It's a Latin expression that means out of many, one. But CRT advances a nation of hyphenated Americans who are focused on their victimhood. In the Pledge of Allegiance, we call our republic one nation under God, indivisible. But CRT utterly rejects this quintessentially American value. CRT, as we've heard, denies objective truth. Objective truth, according to CRT, is a tool of heteropatriarchy, and racist power structures to support the system. Objectivity in rational thought is a Western and masculine concept. According to CRT, all truth is subjective and informed principally by people's personal stories and narratives, to which I would ask, is that a subjective truth? CRT advances equity versus equality. Equity is a code word which means forced redistribution of wealth. And along with the words inclusion and diversity comprises a kind of woke trinity. Obviously, socialism must replace capitalism. Winston Churchill famously pointed out that democracy is the worst form of government there is, except for all the others. The same could be said of capitalism, because for all its flaws, capitalism has brought greater freedom and prosperity than any other competing system. Why? Because it comports with human nature. By contrast, socialism, for all its promises, has brought greater poverty and misery than all competing systems. Why? Because it denies human nature. CRT seeks to undermine the nuclear family. Biblical and even nature-based social constructs like the nuclear family are rejected as artificial and constrictive. In CRT, children belong to the collective, whether the village or the state through coercive public schools. That's why denying subjective gender identities in schools is now taught as negative gender stereotypes and spiritual abuse. CRT advances intrusive governments. Socialism, of course, requires a massive bureaucracy to collect and redistribute wealth, but CRT would go further and impose a kind of police state to impose its social aims. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Kendi argues for an anti-racism constitutional amendment, and with it, a new federal agency called the Department of Anti-Racism to find and punish inevitable offenders. Think of the Jacobins during the French Revolution, or the committees for public virtue in Islamic repressive societies. CRT promotes a kind of ethnic Gnosticism. Bodhi Baucham makes this point very well. The Gnostics, of course, believed that they possessed personal and special spiritual knowledge above their peers and most other religionists. In CRT, having a dark-skinned ethnicity is said to confer upon you a special knowledge and therefore moral authority. And finally, CRT is nothing if not an orthodoxy. With its claims of special knowledge, template for living, reliance on materialism, appeal to passions, and demand for conformance, CRT shares many of the ingredients of the traditional definition of religion, worldview, or orthodoxy. In fact, the former Attorney General William Barr has warned we are rapidly approaching the point, if we have not already reached it, at which the heavy-handed enforcement of secular progressive orthodoxy through government-run schools is totally incompatible with traditional Christianity and other major religious traditions in our country. But like any orthodoxy that does not fit the facts themselves need to change to fit the orthodoxy. Which brings us to the third threat to our children in the public schools, which is historical revisionism. There's an old Soviet joke. The future we know. It's the past that keeps changing. I never thought that would apply to the United States of America, but it is today. The 1619 Project was a 100-page document, what they called a long journalism project, published by the New York Times in August of 2019, in their words, to reframe America's history. The publishing date happened to mark the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Dutch-flagged White Lion. This was a ship that landed on the shores of Virginia that ostensibly brought to our shores the first slaves. Bear in mind that this was 157 years before America declared its independence from Britain. This project was anchored by the lead journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones and sponsored by the Pulitzer Center. What does it teach? It teaches that America was founded in 1619, not 1776. That the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve a slaveocracy, not to gain independence from Britain. That the Declaration of Independence is a complete fraud, including its 27 separate paragraphs that articulate the reasons for separation from England. It teaches that Lincoln was a racist, not an emancipator. That capitalism was invented by slave plantation slaveholders. Now, you would think that such sweeping claims would be supported by rigorous scholarship and references, but you will not find one reference or footnote in this entire document. More telling, it's been discredited by all the world's leading historians, people like Peter Wood, James McPherson, Sean Wilentz, Gordon Wood, and one of my favorites, Robert Woodson. In fact, it is my personal conviction that if and when CRT is ever to be defeated, it will be led by Black academics and scholars. And it's already starting to happen. Men like John McWhorter, Shelby Steele, the woman Carol Swain, Wilfred Riley, Bodhi Baucham, and of course Robert Woodson himself, who runs the 1776 Unites projects, which I highly recommend you look at. He assembled a group of Black scholars, and they recently published this book, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. But notwithstanding the harms of CRT and the academic critique of its claims of historical revisionism, it is very quickly invading our public schools. While a number of states have restricted or outlawed CRT curriculums, California, unfortunately, is not one of them. Here in California, in 2016, Governor Brown signed a law ordering that the Department of Education develop what George described already as a framework to teach ethnic studies. Now, I will freely admit that technically ethnic studies and CRT are two different things. But California's ethnic studies framework is replete with CRT teaching. And besides the State Board of Education, there are many other big and powerful organizations doing their best to ensure that CRT makes its way into our children's classrooms, like the California Teachers Association. It has over 300,000 members and revenue of over $100 million a year. The CTA wants to see CRT taught in all grades, starting in kindergarten. Or what about the National Educators Association? This is the nation's largest professional employee organization. 3 million members and revenues over $500 million a year. New business item 39 commits the organization to critique things like cis-heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and other forms of power and oppression. And we oppose attempts to ban CRT and the 1619 Project. The American Federation of Teachers is committing a $5 million legal fund to defend teachers who are willing to break the law and teach CRT. Here's a recent New York Post article reporting 5,000 teachers signing a petition to break these laws. Similarly, the Zinn Project, if you don't know who Howard Zinn is, he's famous for writing a Marxist People's History of the United States that was published, I think, back in the late 60s or early 70s. He's for getting rid of Columbus Day. And he also has a petition going to incent teachers to teach CRT regardless of state laws. What about the School Superintendents Association? It's the leading organization of school administrators. Here's their statement: "We are living at a time of obscene inequalities, and merely trying to compensate is not enough. We need to dismantle systemic racism. It needs to be a system-wide effort. It needs to permeate all levels of the district, from teaching and learning to buses and buildings to all levels of professional development and community engagement." All to say that virtually every teaching professional organization is fully committed to imposing this upon your children. Now, some of you have probably heard that the Hayward School District recently publicized the fact that they're going to spend $40 million to introduce CRT in its schools. But this is kind of unique because most schools want to cover this up. They're very aware of the fact that parents are invading school districts, and so they're teaching it incognito. But here's some data from our friends at Parents Defending Education. This is a Washington, D.C. 501c3 showing sample curriculums and lesson plan assignments reported directly from teachers and parents that are being taught in various communities right here in California. This is just a partial list. Here's another report from our friends at California for Equal Rights, which have chronicled the Anaheim School District's intent and actions to deploy CRT lesson plans, celebrations, and curriculums right here in our backyard. We have a copy of this report at our back table, so I encourage you to pick one up. If you're not familiar with the name Christopher Rufo, I encourage you to Google it. Christopher Rufo, R-U-F-O, is probably the leading journalist covering this topic in America today, including the curriculum being imposed in the school district in Cupertino, where children are being learned to deconstruct their white identities. What does that look like? Well, here's Barner Hess's 8 White Identities color wheel, which describes the regime of whiteness, where light-skinned kids are told to identify where on the spectrum they happen to lie. From white abolitionists to white privilege to white supremacist. Unless you think this was an isolated instance, I already mentioned the Clark versus Nevada School District case in Nevada. Here's a quote from that complaint of last year. In this particular case, a mixed race high school boy, I think he had a white father and a black mother. The father apparently is deceased, but he was mistaken as white. Apparently he was light skinned. And they were imposing a CRT curriculum on him, including telling him, you need to unlearn your basic Judeo-Christian training that you got from your family. And he refused to go along with it. Whereupon they told him, well, not only you're going to fail this class, you're not going to graduate from high school. Whereupon his mother, Gabrielle, had the temerity to sue the school district. And she won, by the way. A key reference book in California's ethnic studies framework is called Rethinking Ethnic Studies. I have a copy of it back at the back table. In the first few pages is found this matrix of social identity and intersectional power. This is already being used in the Salinas School District. What are the goals of ethnic studies for California children? Well, here are just a few. Address the concept of intersectionality, power structures and forms of oppression. Critique empire building and its relationship to white supremacy. Challenge imperialist colonial beliefs and practices such as patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, anti-indigeneity, Islamophobia, and transphobia. Explore the histories, struggles, and triumphs of the LGBT community, and place high value on ancestral knowledge, including offering chants to Aztec and Mayan gods. You don't have to look very far into the people and the roots of critical race theory to find out that it has definite occultic underpinnings. The BLM co-founders admitted, we speak our ancestors' names, and you kind of invoke the spirit, and then their spirits actually become present with you. Indeed, the spirits do become present with them, but they're not from their ancestors. Regardless, California's ethnic studies program encourages teachers to engage children in these kinds of practices. Here's one example from the framework. The unity clap is led by an instructor. Inlak Ek is a Mayan expression for pagan universalism. Everything is interconnected. Tezcatlipoca is the Aztec god of providence. Quetzalcoatl relates to the patron god of the Aztec priesthood. Hunab-Ku is the head of the Mayan pantheon. You can Google this and find teachers on YouTube leading their children into chants to these gods. All to say that the combination of comprehensive sexuality education, critical race theory, and historical revisionism compose a triple threat to our children in the public school system. And as George mentioned, as far as separation of church and state goes, well, it only seems to apply to one faith, to one worldview, the Judeo-Christian worldview. It amounts to a kind of orthodoxy, complete with its own creeds, doctrines, and demands for conformance. And orthodoxies, as promulgated in the public schools, must lead to a pedagogy, which is a system or framework of teaching that transcends any particular class or curriculum. And this is what's so important to understand. The triple threat is meant to infuse the entire culture of our public schools. It means to become the official worldview of what we teach and how we teach, which if allowed to run its course, as Marxist-inspired movements have everywhere been tried do, inevitably leads to chaos. Here's the question. Are the public schools justified in teaching such an orthodoxy to our children? Well, I want to leave you with a quote from this particular case that goes all the way back to 1943. It's West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. Now, bear in mind, this is 1943. This was right in the middle of World War II, a time of heightened nationalism and patriotism. The issue in the case was there were a group of Jehovah's Witnesses parents who were upset by the fact that the school district in Virginia was requiring their children to salute the Stars and Stripes. And despite this time frame in American history, here's what the court said. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. I submit that if compelling children to salute the flag is a form of orthodoxy, CRT is far, far, far more so. If there's any hope for our kids in the public schools, it will come as the result of brave and persistent parents like Gabriella Clark in Nevada, actively pushing back against the tide and saying, no more, not in my school, not to my child. And for the sake of our children, we must all become Gabriella Clarks, and we must do it soon. Thank you. Now we're going to move right along. If you need to use the restroom, please get up and go. We've got a couple more presentations before the break, but at this time I want to introduce a good friend. Neda Higuera is an attorney for Tyler and Birch, LLP, and the nonprofit organization Advocates for Faith and Freedom. Advocates for Faith and Freedom is a public interest law firm committed to protecting the right of people to freely live out their faith. Since getting her license to practice law in 2014, Neda has loved the ability to advocate for her clients. She is passionate about the people she serves. While at Tyler and Birch, Neda has helped successfully vindicate a client's religious liberties in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She has also been featured on the cover of Focus on the Family magazine for her victory in overturning the Anti-Life and Unconstitutional Reproductive Fact Act in California. She is dedicated to protecting religious liberty and parental rights in the courts. Neda also has a 7-month-old baby boy and 4-year-old daughter, and she's going to tell us about students' and parents' rights with regard to everything we've just heard. Welcome, Neda.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you to each one of you who are here tonight, and there are some familiar faces. And being a constitutional attorney in California certainly is not the easiest thing, and there are a lot of days that I'm discouraged. But doing things like this, where I get to see parents who care and who want to do something, and who are engaged, that's really what keeps me going. And you're here, for my kids, for your kids, and it's a huge sacrifice, so thank you so much for caring. And there is, triple threat is an understatement. There are so many other threats as well. We can run off the list, but all that to say is we can get discouraged and overwhelmed by, really it's evil and darkness. And the best thing, though, about that is that he who is within us is greater than he who's in the world. And so there's a lot that we can do. And it's like if you put out a big fire, you're not putting it out by yourself. You have one bucket of water, and all of us have that one bucket. And it's not our responsibility to take everything on, but we can do our small part, and just you being here really is doing that. And my goal with my presentation is to equip you with concrete statutory laws that do protect and promote your rights. There is an abundance of law that goes against parental rights, and we've heard all about that, but I want to focus on the rights that we do have that are clear and that are statutorily delineated. And at the end, I'll give my email address, so if there's any questions, feel free to email me if you can't stay for the Q&A panel. Okay, so let's get right into it. I broke it down into top 5 rights for parents to know. You have a right to be actively involved in your child's education, a right to be involved in the selection of curriculum, right to opt out of all sex ed instruction and surveys, right to opt out of standardized testing. And then, of course, there's a little thing called the Constitution, so we do have those rights still. And I also want to say this PowerPoint, if you email me, I can send you this PowerPoint if you, you don't feel like you have to write everything down, or, this is your one shot. So we'll make it available. And I'm going to go through each of those rights and give you some concrete examples of how we can use them. And I hope you won't get too bogged down in the legal language, but I think it's important to actually look at the text itself so you do see how protective it is of parental rights. So first, the right to be involved in your child's education. And this is straight out of the California Education Code. Parents and guardians of pupils enrolled in public schools have the right and should have the opportunity as mutually supportive and respective partners in the education of their children within the public schools to be informed by the school and participate in the education of their children. Now, this specifically includes these rights right here are delineated in the code: to observe your child's classroom during class time, to meet with your child's teacher and principal, to volunteer and assist in your child's classroom, ensure a safe and supportive environment for learning, and receive information about and opt out of psychological testing. And I know sometimes schools can make it seem like you're that annoying mom or dad who is just always around and always in their ear, but you are just exercising your right as delineated in the statute. And so don't ever think that you are, just being a nag or bugging them too much. It actually, our liberal California legislator gave you this right and understands how important it is to be a supporter and to be involved in your child's education in public school. Fortunately, we're not at the state now where your child belongs to the state, and the law clearly shows your child belongs to you and you are a partner in their education. A partner is an understatement, but at the very least, we are a partner. All right, and then another, let's see. Yeah, so parents also possess a right and covenant to guide and direct the upbringing of their children, and courts have repeatedly honored and upheld this right. And I listed 2 cases there, but even as early as July of this year, the Ninth Circuit referred to this same language in upholding parental rights in the private school context, where the governor shut down in-person private schools and public schools, and a lawsuit was brought, and the Ninth Circuit said, particularly with private school, that the governor has no right to shut that down because of parental rights. Unfortunately, that same thing didn't apply to public schools, but it did apply to private schools, and in that case by the Ninth Circuit of July, it's Brach v. Newsom, B-R-A-C-H. And the Ninth Circuit upheld parental rights. And I do want to know, while we're on the topic of the Ninth Circuit, it's a lot different of a Ninth Circuit than it was in Palmdale v. Fields, which George had spoken about. Donald Trump appointed 10 conservative judges. There is a total of 29 judges in the entire Ninth Circuit, which covers 8 states. So at least 10 of those 29 are appointed by a freedom-loving president. So, yeah, I don't want it to be all hopeless. It's not all hopeless because things are changing, tides are shifting. Yes, there was a period of time where things got out of hand and we heard a lot about the history that got us where we are today, but we're rewriting that slowly but surely. It's not going to happen overnight. All the changes didn't happen overnight. And so getting our state back to where it should be, we're getting there. And I'm sure, even 4 years ago, I personally, I can't speak for everyone, but I wasn't involved in these topics and in speaking on parental rights. And it really is just like there's a huge awakening, and I'm so thankful for that. And it's working. It really is working. Okay, so I'm on a little bit of a pedestal because, we're making a difference, and I don't want it to just feel so overwhelming because it's not. And that's the enemy that tells you that. So if you're ever feeling that way, just, tell the enemy to shut up. All right, so the right to be involved in the selection of curriculum. And the code states, each district board shall provide for substantial teacher involvement in the selection of instructional materials and shall is not discretionary, they have to Promote the involvement of parents and other members of the community in the selection of instructional materials. Now, to enforce these rights, it does take time and to be involved and to know where the process is of adopting curriculum and which curriculum is adopted, which subject matter is adopted during which year. But this is your right that you can use to be involved in that. But yes, it will take time. It's not something that, as a lawyer, I can just say this is your right, and then all of a sudden everything is fixed. But you can be armed with the education code and go to your local school district office and ask about the curriculum process, or if you know a teacher. I mean, this is your right, and it's a shall. They can't shut you out. And if they do, then let's bring a lawsuit and take it to the newly conservative Ninth Circuit. Next is the right to opt out of all sex ed instruction and surveys. And this is the California Healthy Youth Act that George so articulately covered. But there is, I want to spend some time particularly on the right to opt out. And so within the text of this California Healthy Youth Act, which is terrible, there is a whole entire section about parents. It is the intent of the legislator to respect the rights of parents, I'm reading that correctly, I didn't just make that up, or guardians to supervise their children's education on these subjects. The legislator intends to create a streamlined process to make it easier for parents and guardians to review materials and evaluation tools related to comprehensive sexual health education and HIV prevention education, and if they wish, to excuse their children from participation in all or part of that instruction or evaluation. The legislator recognizes that parents and guardians have the ultimate responsibility for imparting values regarding human sexuality to their children. Parents also have the right to excuse their child from any and all sexual health tests, questionnaires, and surveys. Now, the reason that this is important is because some schools and teachers, school board members will tell you you can opt out of all of it or nothing. You can't pick part of it to opt out, particularly the LGBTQ or transgender section. However, I'm not mincing words when it says all or part of that instruction. And so this is really important, and I wrote an entire legal memo about this. So if there is a school or a teacher telling you, no, you cannot pick which parts to opt out of, we can send them a letter. I can give you the legal memo. So please, it was such a fallacy a few years ago that was going around that you can't opt out. You absolutely can, all of it or part of it. And it's ultimately your responsibility for imparting values regarding human sexuality to your children. The law still has language that we can use and we can hang our hats on and be armed with. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the right to opt out because it is very important. So some schools have unlawfully prevented parents from exercising the right to opt out. There's no exception to parental rights to opt out of all or part of sexual health instruction. Now, you don't have the absolute right to opt out of, let's say history class, and they're talking about, contributions of LGBTQ people within history. You don't have the right to opt out of those classes. Language arts, even assemblies, unfortunately, these diversity assemblies or whatnot. But it's within the sex ed class, or, if that's part of the overall health class or PE class, that is where you do have an absolute right to opt out of all or part of it. And this is the breakdown of the California Healthy Youth Act. It has 4 articles. There's an entire article about notice and parental excuse. And in order to help parents exercise that right, schools have to send a written notice to parents at the beginning of the school year and no fewer than 14 days before the instruction is delivered. And the law says exactly what the school has to tell you. They have to tell you that the curriculum is available for your review at least 2 weeks before this is presented to your children. They have to disclose whether the instruction will be provided by school personnel or an outside consultant, such as Planned Parenthood. They have to advise you that you have the right to excuse your child from sexual health instruction, and inform you that in order to opt out, you must submit a request to the school in writing. So this is not an active opt-in. If you don't do anything, your child will be subjected to this. This is, you have to affirmatively opt out in writing. And like George said, the Protect Our Kids website has an opt-out. Several different law firms have opt-outs. We do, Advocates for Faith and Freedom, Alliance Defending Freedom, PJI, Pacific Justice Institute. You know, a lot of us are really on top of this in order to help parents so that they don't have to sit there and write their own, and they're freely available. So you don't even have to wait. If you know you just absolutely don't want your children to be subjected to any of this, you can, on the first day of school, send the opt-out, written opt-out that you make a copy of and you give to the office. You can probably give it to multiple people too, maybe even the teacher, to let the teacher know, just so that there's no miscommunication, and have that there so that when this is taught, and you can even know when it's taught, you're supposed to be provided that information, and you can pull your kid out, and you have a right to ask for the school to provide productive instruction during that time. Unfortunately, sometimes schools, you know, if you opt your child out, they'll be singled out and discriminated against. Same thing with like the masks and vaccines. Well, you know, we'll let you do that, but you're gonna have to sit way over there by yourself. And that's not just at all either. And so as parents, we need to advocate for our kids and make sure you know, if your kid opts out, where they'll be and what they'll be taught, and that it's not a form of punishment, because legally they cannot punish your children for opting out. This is an affirmative right that the liberal California legislator has even recognized. And another thing, there's a lot of control that a local school board has, and that even local schools have. You know, a lot of times they'll say, well, we have to teach this, and that's absolutely not true. And so I wanted to include the language that's required to be taught. And also, so the first part of this slide is Education Code 51933, and the instruction has to be age appropriate, and it has to be factual information, needs to be medically accurate. So if there's something that they're teaching that's not either factually or medically accurate, these are all possible concrete violations of law that are taking place. The instruction and material shall not reflect or promote bias against any person on the basis of any category protected by Ed Code 220, and it includes religion. So the instruction can't be biased against, Judeo-Christian faith or Islam, whatever it is. I mean, the instruction has to be inclusive. They love throwing that word around. Well, it also needs to be inclusive of faith-based communities within these classes. And so AB 329, the California Healthy Youth Act, it doesn't specify how these topics have to be taught. The only thing that it does state is that the instruction and materials must be inclusive of LGBTQ, and they shall affirmatively recognize that people have different sexual orientations when discussing or providing examples of relationships and couples. They have to be inclusive of same-sex relationships. So like the dental dam and all that nonsense that you heard, that is not required whatsoever. The curriculum that they say, the 5 curriculum that are approved by the states, those are not required. All that's required, and I'm not a teacher by any means, but I can make a sex ed curriculum that does all of this, that is inclusive of LGBTQ, but that does honor sexuality and teach risks and teach kids in an appropriate manner. If you wanted a public school to teach your kid that, at least what they can do is make it factually appropriate, medically appropriate, and not go over the line. This is the only requirement the school has. The school has no other requirement to teach all the other disgusting stuff that it teaches. So, they can't say their hands are tied or they're afraid they're going to lose funding. That excuse in particular, when I hear school district officials, superintendents say, oh, well, I want to give parents the options, but we might lose funding. That's absolutely baloney. For, to not use profanity, we're in a church. That's baloney. There is no incidence of the state, there's no law that allows a state to withhold funding because it disagrees with a policy that the local school board is implementing. On the contrary, local school boards are created with autonomy and local control. That's why we have, all these different school districts, and then you have county boards of education. It is within their purview that they get to mandate this. Currently, in the state of emergency we're in, there is a little less control when it comes to COVID mandates because the state of emergency suspends all of the administrative procedures and the normal legislative process, where your elected officials make the decisions on social distancing, masks, everything else. That's normally how it works, but under the state of emergency, it bypasses that. And so that's the only exception. But for curriculum and opt-out and all these other things, even critical race theory, these are within the control and discretion of your local school board officials. We hold them accountable by going to school board meetings, which I'm sure a lot of you have been at, and it makes my heart so happy when I see videos of the boardrooms packed with parents. It's just amazing. And so when it comes to sex ed, they do have a lot of control. This is the only thing that ties their hands. They just have to be inclusive of LGBTQ. And so just don't let them use excuses. And then the fourth right is the right to opt out of standardized tests. And that's pretty self-explanatory. And the law also says that your student cannot be discriminated against for opting out. Now, the most important is your child's right to free speech and religion. One thing I didn't include on here, but I also want to discuss is that there's a 14th Amendment right to equal protection, which essentially is that you're be discriminated against on the basis of race, religion, etc. And there's been case law that students don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gates. They still have all those constitutional rights. Yes, there has been carve-outs with Palmdale versus Fields and some of these other cases, but generally speaking, the Constitution is still in place. And here are some examples of what, particularly the right to free speech and freedom of religion. And I know there's another speaker here that's going to elaborate on this and equip you further to know your children's rights in school as it pertains to religion. But they can wear clothing or jewelry, a cross, for example. They can organize a religious club on campus, refer to religious beliefs and assignments, bring a Bible to school, hand out flyers or petitions, talk to fellow students and school officials about their faith, and pray on campus. And schools may not compel speech involving intimate matters of race, gender, sexuality, and religion. Schools may not coerce students to accept and affirm politicized and discriminatory principles and statements. And the perfect example of that, which you already heard about, is the Clark versus State Public Charter School. And this is the mom that filed that lawsuit. And the interesting thing here is, her son was a student in high school, and the father had passed away. The father was white, as Mark explained. But the mom had two other kids. She ended up being remarried, and she had two other kids, and she married a black man, and so her other kids were fully black. And in this class, the student was required to talk about his racism and how he's an oppressor, and how he's an oppressor to his siblings, because he had to reflect on his own life and his own circle, and he's an oppressor to his mom because he's half white and he looks white. And so, yes, she brought a lawsuit, and it was on the First Amendment because compelled speech. The student had to stand in front of the class and be compelled to talk about his race and his gender and his sexual orientation. The right to free speech includes the right to speak what you want and the right from someone else to force you what to say. And so it was a First Amendment And then also the 14th Amendment, equal protection of racism and equal protection under the law. And so that was a good lawsuit. And we have, this is just one example, all over the country, critical race theory lawsuits are popping up from teachers who are brave enough to bring lawsuits saying that this creates a hostile work environment. We saw a lot of that with sexual harassment and, you know, the hostility. Well, now it's really creating a hostile work environment where these teachers are being taught that because they're white, they're inferior and, you know, they need to bow down to people that are darker than them. So you have teachers bringing lawsuits, parents, students, and it's great to see, and not just lawsuits, you know, the law is one avenue to assert your rights. But you also have a voice, as you all know, to advocate for your children. And you know, some of it comes down to really an ethical or moral issue. Sometimes the law doesn't necessarily fully protect you, but you have to be that voice of reason. And so all over the country, voices are rising up, and you heard Mark talk about it too, against critical race theory. And we need to keep that pressure up. And for a while there, I think I'm crazy being in California and constantly hearing Gavin Newsom talk. I have to listen to him for my work, and it's just, but I listened to the Oklahoma governor today, actually, in one of my podcasts. There was a snippet of him speaking. Oklahoma actually passed a law banning critical race theory to be taught in public schools. Yes. Don't move to Oklahoma. This isn't an infomercial. It's tempting, but we need you all here. And he gave a speech about it and said, under no circumstances will public tax dollars be funding racism. And he talked about Martin Luther King's principles, and he said that's the type of state that we are. We are going to implement those principles. He even addressed difficult issues such as like history and racism within history, because we can't deny that. And he said these are tough topics that our kids have to grapple with and learn from, and they have to be taught factual history. And to hear this governor was so refreshing, you know, but we're not crazy. California, the rest of California is, but you hear a governor taking that stand, and it's like, wow, thank the Lord that, you know, he's reasonable and there's actually laws being passed. And God willing, with this recall, not to get too political, but with this recall and really good candidates that are up, who are yes, you all know. I don't even have to name names, all right? You guys know, and so there is hope that we could even see that in California, where we see a legislation preventing and prohibiting that, calling it what it is, which is racist. All right, a few more slides, and then I'm going to be done. Okay, so again, there are other avenues besides legal avenues. You know, parents, instruct your kids, prepare them spiritually, and I would say be their closest confidant and teach them how to ask questions, question authority in a healthy manner. You know, think logically about these and really just ask questions. They don't have to, you know, raise their hand and say, no, you're wrong. You know, you can ask very thoughtful questions and equip them to, you know, to be that light. And when there is so much darkness, you know, the darker the room, the more the tiniest light shines. And so equip them to do that. Join the PTA, consider it depending on your PTA, and tell your students, you know, particularly as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, tell your kids that safe adults don't ask to keep secrets. There are no secrets. And if an adult ever tells them to keep a secret, they need to run the other way and they need to tell you. And just that small statement, I think, could save a lot of heartache and trouble. Tell them they have the right to walk out and head to the office. If they're being discriminated against, if they're being forced to talk about their racism, you know, and talk about their sexuality, oh, they can get up and walk to that office. You can even, you know, my cards are out there. You can give your students my cards. They can text me if they want. You know, we can be cool. They can add me on Instagram. But they need to know that they have rights and their views matter, and their voice matters. And at the very least, if they're uncomfortable, they can walk out and go to the office. And the last thing I want to end is a scripture, particularly for kids. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. And, public schools, we really do need Christians and Christian children within them to be lights and to be examples. And, it really is a huge act of faith to be able to raise your kid up in that. And so that if that's what God's calling you to do, we're here. I'm here to support you legally. And, again, he who is within you and your children is far greater than he who is in the world. And that is my email address. I don't give it away freely usually, but I'm giving it all to you because you're here, you're taking your time. I check my own email, and, God willing, I will be able to respond to all of your questions. If not, we have a team of attorneys, and I can give it to them as well. So thank you for your time, and thank you all for being here. It blesses my heart.
So the four of us drew straws to see who would give the bad news and who would give the good news. George and I got the bad news straws. Netta got a good news straws, and we have our next speaker also got a good news straws. But before I introduce him, we have a brief video from someone that was supposed to speak to us tonight, David Schmoose. Let's see if this is going to cooperate. He's the executive director and a good friend of POK's, and though he could not be here tonight, he took the time to speak to us through this short video.
I am so happy to be with you, but let me get right to the point. Our public schools are in a cultural and moral crisis. From radical sex ed to destroying the innocence of our kids, to sowing gender confusion in their hearts, to labeling our students as oppressors or victims just because of their skin color. Our public schools have even more become the epicenter of the struggle to protect kids. And let me say that I know there are hundreds of thousands of heroic people of faith and integrity teaching and leading in our public schools who are holding the line against these challenges, sometimes in very private ways. I know because we represent many of them here at Christian Educators Association International. But despite their efforts, many are questioning whether or not we have reached a tipping point in our schools. But I believe there is still an opportunity for us to change direction. Let me suggest two simple ways that we can work together to oppose and even reverse this radical agenda. First, we can dry up much of the source of this agenda by defunding the politicized teachers' unions. Second, we can equip and support teachers of faith that are in public schools to more boldly live out their calling to be lights in what can often feel like an increasingly dark place. So first, let's talk about teachers' unions. Here in California, our state teachers' unions have been leading the charge for this radical agenda, taking their members' union dues to get the laws passed that have created this crisis. Laws like the Healthy Youth Act, or AB 1266, which hurts kids by enabling gender confusion and requires educators to deceive their students' parents. So what do? Well, every California teacher who belongs to a union pays about $1,100 each year in dues. Of that $1,100, about $900 goes to the state and national unions, which spend a huge portion of that money on politics, advocacy, curriculum, conferences, and lots of other activities that promote this agenda. If you multiply this by the 400,000 teachers union members in California, that's $360 million every year. It is no wonder that the CTA has been described as the most powerful interest group in the state. But I have some exciting news. Because of a U.S. Supreme Court victory in 2018, we can dry up a big chunk of the funding for this agenda. Because of the Janus ruling, Teachers now have a constitutional right to leave their unions and not pay them a cent. And many teachers are leaving unions because their unions don't represent their values. In fact, a 2017 Education Week survey found that 57% of educators identify as either Republican or independent, and only 29% consider themselves liberal or very liberal. George Barna says that half of all public school teachers in the nation go to church at least once a month. Imagine how much we could reduce support for this radical agenda if just the church-going and conservative teachers in California left the unions. Of course, if you are a teacher or know a teacher, this brings up a lot of questions. Let me assure you that pay, benefits, and retirement are absolutely not affected by union membership. You can learn more and opt out of your union at ceai.org/unions. And this brings us to our second way to reverse this radical agenda, equipping teachers to courageously and legally live out their faith in our public schools to stand in the gap for our kids. This is one goal that our ministry, CEAI, has been working towards since 1953. We have thousands of members across the nation and in all 50 states. We provide double the amount of liability insurance the union offers, a local attorney to protect teachers in the case of a job action, and unlimited access to our legal and educational consultants. And we do this all for about 1/5 of the cost of California union dues. And one of the great things about our coverage is that it remains in your name and can't be taken from you. Union coverage is provided at the discretion of the union and can be pulled if they don't agree with your politics or your faith. In addition, we provide access to resources like online webinars, local events, an award-winning magazine, compelling videos, daily devotionals, and much more, all designed to help Christian educators understand how to be lights for Jesus in our public schools without breaking the law. If you are a public school educator concerned about this agenda, I'm encouraging you, take a step of faith, leave your union, stop sending tens of thousands of dollars over the course of your career to fund this agenda. Then prayerfully consider joining CEAI to restore your protections and get equipped and encouraged. We are praying for you as we work together to demonstrate God's love by protecting our kids. Thank you.
So we have one more presentation before I know our well-needed break. But to talk more about living out your faith in the public schools, I want to introduce good friend Eric Brewer. Eric is a former public school educator and is founder and president of Gateways to Better Education, a nonprofit founded in 1991 to help public school educators, parents, and school leaders teach about the important contribution the Bible and Christianity make to the world. At its website, as its website indicates, we show them how to do this legally and appropriately within existing constitutional boundaries, current laws, and state academic standards. Please welcome Eric Brewer.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. How y'all doing? All right. All right, let me bring you some good news tonight. How many of you know a Christian teacher, an administrator, a parent with their kids in public schools? All right? Good. I have some great news for you. I'm going to give you something that you can pass along to them that will really help, as I like to say, set the captives free. What our organization does, we work all across the country, is we do two things. We promote religious freedom in the public schools, helping teachers and students understand what they can do, what they can say. And we help teach about the Bible and Christianity as it relates to their academic subject. We show them all the different ways that it intersects. It empowers them to do what they want to do, but they're so afraid to do because they're just not sure. Here's the good news. Wait, before I get to that good news. One of the things that we do is we research every state's academic standards across the country, looking for where the Bible and Christianity is expected to be included. And these are hidden gems that I can guarantee you, the people you raised your hand about, the Christians you know in the public schools, they don't know that it's there. I've been doing this a long time, and we call them the jaw droppers, because people are just like, what? That's in our standards. Currently, in the current California academic standards, every sixth grader is expected to know the gospel. Did you know that? Yeah. When they learn that period in Roman history, and they learn about the birth of Christianity, if you went to the California Department of Education's website and you looked up sixth grade history, social studies, here's what you would see. Now I'll show you the slide. Note the origins. This is what students are expected to do. They are expected to note the origins of Christianity in the Jewish messianic prophecies, the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth as described in the New Testament, and the contribution of St. Paul the Apostle to the definition and spread of Christian beliefs. And then they put in parentheses, for example, belief in the Trinity, resurrection, and salvation. Every sixth grader in California is supposed to know Paul's message of salvation. I guarantee you, teachers you know, don't even know that's there. Because if it's not in the textbook, they just don't teach it. I remember a teacher up in Modesto calling me. Said he was in trouble because he was a reading teacher, sixth grade reading. And he said, you know, ever so often when I have kids read things, I sometimes have them read, where do we get certain terms, like the Good Samaritan? What is that? You talk about somebody being a Good Samaritan. So I have them read the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now I got a parent who's all over me. And, you know, she's going to go get an attorney, and she's gone to the principal. Now I got to meet with the principal and defend myself. And, Eric, what can I say? I said, sixth grade? Let me read to you what you're supposed to be teaching them. He'd been teaching for many years. He said, I had no idea. I know we got a copy of those standards somewhere in our school. He went and got a copy, and he went to his meeting with his principal and said, well, not only was I doing the right thing, I should have been doing all these other things too. Thank you very much. You empower people, and Christians saturate the system. Superintendents, school board members, educators, parents, students. They just don't know what to do. I kind of sometimes equate it to, it's like the troops landing on the beach in Normandy, but they don't have any weapons, so they just hunker down and hope not to get hit. But you can give them the tools in their hands to have impact. And I'm going to share with you in just a few minutes how you can get this information to your friends. It doesn't stop there. In seventh grade, here's what the History Social Science Framework says, and this was added in 2016. Through selections from biblical literature, students will learn about those teachings of Jesus that advocate compassion, justice, and love for others. He taught that God loved all his creation, regardless of status or circumstance, and that humans should reflect that love in relations with one another. Jesus shared the Jewish belief in one God, but he added the promise of eternal salvation to those who believe in him as their Savior. So sixth grade, the gospel. Seventh grade, the gospel. Both are expected to read biblical literature in order to understand Christianity. So when a teacher does this, and we have training for teachers on how to do this, we tell them you put that standard right at the bottom of the handout. So when it goes home and a parent says, what do you study in this? Oh, I see, he's just fulfilling this standard. Okay. I use the speed limit analogy. We tell teachers, you know, if the speed limit is 65 on the freeway, I'm not asking you to go 70. You're not trying to sneak something in your classroom. I just want you to go 60. You could even drive 55, that's okay. But some of you are driving 30, and some of you are afraid to even get on the freeway because you're not sure what to do. And you pull back the curtain and say, here's all the things you're expected to do, and it sets the captives free. Here's in English language arts. Students are to analyze how a modern work of fiction draws on themes, patterns of events, or character types from myths, traditional stories, or religious works such as the Bible. So again, they're supposed to read biblical stories. I was down in Texas, and the teacher was telling me after this, he said, you know, I've got a student who just came in from Vietnam. He's an immigrant, and he really doesn't know American culture, and he certainly doesn't know Texas culture. And he said, so the headline in our sports page were about two high school teams. And one was a dominant team, and the other one was just a little school, not very big and not very good. And the headline was, "This is going to be a David versus Goliath competition." And this young man came to me and he said, "I thought football was a team sport. What are these two guys?" He had no idea. But you see, this is what they're supposed to do, is understand these stories that are used in our culture, in our literature. Okay, so you want to know how to get our research on this? Because we research every state. Get your cameras out. I want you to take a picture of this next slide. All right? And if you have one of those QR code things, you can do this here. Our research on California academic standards and laws. Do you know we have a law that protects a teacher when they use the Bible in a classroom? Yes, we have a law that protects a teacher. So if you go to our gogateways.org/standards, you fill out the information, we will mail you our copy of our research, kindergarten through 12th grade, and all the laws that support religious freedom. Or you can use the QR code there to also log in. All right, more good news. Students' religious freedoms. Let's talk a little bit more in detail on that. On January 16th, 2020, right before COVID, the U.S. Department of Education came out with guidance on constitutionally protected prayer and religious expression in public elementary and secondary schools. We had been lobbying the Department of Education for about 2 years, asking them to update their guidance. It hadn't been updated since 2003. We said, okay, it's been a long time, it needs to be updated, and we gave them a bunch of recommendations. And to our delight, they responded well, and they updated it, and they reissued it, and they used our recommendations. And they surprised me by inviting me back to the White House to be a part of the distribution. That was an amazing, amazing experience. Someday I'll have to tell you all the backstory on what happened before the press got there. This is what you see behind the scenes. The press was really loud. And they told us that before we got in there. They said, now, when the press comes in, it's going to get really loud. Just ignore them, pretend they're not there, and keep on doing what you're doing. So just to give you a little bit of a recap on this, and we have got lots of information on our table for you about this, but students can pray, they can read their Bibles or other religious materials, they can talk about their faith at school. The government looks at it as free speech. You can speak about whatever you want, you can talk to whoever you want, including your maker. Students can express their faith in their classwork, in their homework, in their class discussions. So if a student wants, if the assignment is write about one of your heroes and a student wants to write about Jesus, absolutely they have the right to do that. They cannot be denied. Teachers can organize prayer groups with other teachers and have Bible studies on campus during their break times and that sort of thing. Students can express their faith at a school event, a talent show. If they want to sing a Christian song, they have the right to do that. They can reference their faith during their graduation ceremonies and so forth. Now, there's a number of rights, and we have a list of 9 specific to students and 2 specific to teachers and their right to teach about religious freedom. But you ready for some more good news? The Orange County Department of Education now provides 2 videos on its website promoting religious freedom. One is a 5-minute video that administrators can show to their faculty during a staff meeting that says, look, federal guidance has come out. Here's what students' religious freedoms are. We don't want problems, so everybody understand it. And then there's another video, a 3-minute video, that teachers can show to their students in class, either from morning announcements or a civics lesson, that says, this is your religious freedoms here in school and in class. And it goes through all their freedoms. Now, for those Christians that you know, that you raised your hand about, they need to know about this link to the Orange County Department of Education. Because they could show that in class, and if somebody says, what are you doing? Oh, I found this on the Orange County Department of Education's website, and I thought it'd be a great civics lesson. Can't disagree with that. I want my students to understand my classroom is a safe place for them to talk about their faith. It's a welcoming environment. Okay? So we have flyers on our table that'll give you the link to the Orange County Department of Education's website where these videos are provided. I want all of you to come back, get that flyer so that you can take that to your friends. You give them the good news. I'm telling you, it'll be like bringing food to a starving person. They will just be delighted. So if you go to our website, you'll see we've got information on the actual guidance itself. We also have pamphlets back here, little pocket-sized pamphlets called Free to Speak. We've got free ones you can take, and then we've got them in packs of 50. Encourage you to get them for your church, your youth group. Give them out to your youth and say, hey, give these to your friends. If you're on a campus club, give it out in the club. We want these to just scatter throughout and saturate the public schools here in Orange County. Since my visit to the White House, we've launched what we call the National Free to Speak campaign. And it's about two things: promoting religious freedom in schools and teaching about the good that the Bible and Christianity bring to the world. You know, so often students these days only learn about Christianity by studying the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and the Salem witch trials. We want them to know all the good that Christianity has done, and so we help teachers do that. We really see it as like the parable of the seed sower, Matthew 13, where there's a lot of hard ground out of confusion and fear regarding religion in schools. What we do is we help break up that hard soil by just helping the Christians who are already there have the confidence to know what they can do and then to have the confidence to do it. And so we work with churches and parents and educators, school administrators, school boards, and school ministries. We want to see school ministries flourish because as their schools become more faith-friendly, there are more opportunities for them to sow the seeds of truth. It's really about equipping the body of Christ in our public schools. You know, we kind of have these silos of excellence. Everybody's doing their own thing. What we want to do is say, hey, who are the Christians in this school? Let's unite them. Let's equip them. Let's engage them so they can have a difference on their campus. Think of it this way. Say you've got 3 churches in a particular community, and you start mapping out where are the schools in our community. You go, wow, we got a lot of schools all around these churches. And then you start actually mapping out, well, where does our congregation go Monday through Friday? And you go, well, you know, we got a lot of kids that go up to this high school up here, and so that means a lot of parents are involved with that high school. And we got some in this elementary school. Oh, and we got a teacher that goes to this elementary school as well as some kids. We got all these, oh, there's another teacher. And then this church up here says, wait a second, we send a teacher to that school. We never knew the other teacher was a Christian. Believe me, there are Christians in schools teaching. They don't even know each other are Christians. And this church is sending them here, and all of a sudden you start mapping out and you go, wow, the body of Christ is just saturating our schools. What we want to do through our training is unite them, bring them together, and equip them with tools and strategies, very practical strategies for what they could do in their classroom across the curriculum. We also want to work with the local ministries like Child Evangelism Fellowship. Any of you involved with Good News Clubs? Any of you involved with Moms in Prayer? Any of you involved in FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes? We want to see these ministries flourish on their campuses. We want to point people during our training, and we do virtual training, webinars. I'll be telling you about those in just a minute. During that virtual training, we point people to these ministries and say, get involved with these ministries. We want them to flourish. Here's a video that describes a little bit about who we are. Can you hear that? There we go. In today's culture, it's a challenge for families to raise their children with biblical values. And since the majority of Christian families send their children to public schools, parents have reason to be concerned. Over 80% of surveyed adults who left the faith in their 20s first had doubts about the Bible in middle school and high school. Since 2007, educators reported a 60% increase in the time they spend teaching evolution. 82% of public school teens say there is no religious support or prayer groups at their schools. And confusion abounds over what can and cannot be done with religious expression in schools. But in the midst of these challenges, there is opportunity. Schools are filled with Christians at every level.
superintendents, school board members, school administrators, educators, parents, and students. Every state has academic standards that expect students to learn about the Bible and Christianity. And federal and state laws protect students' and teachers' religious freedoms. When these freedoms are lived out, we see a direct impact within public schools.
I can empower my students to live out their faith in the classroom. So a few years ago, I transferred to a second grade classroom. And when I came in, they had already their set curriculum, and the teachers were doing a biography project where the students get to choose someone to research, and they get to dress up as that person and put on like a living museum. One of my students named Olivia chose her project to be on Jesus. After Olivia chose her project, the teachers and I got together and we talked about what was going on in our classroom, and they expressed their doubt that I should let Olivia do her project on Jesus, as that could be a controversial topic. However, I knew my rights within the law and her rights as a student, that she can choose to express her faith in the public school classroom. So the day came for all of my students to put on their living museum project. Olivia glowed. Her grandparents even handed her a Bible during her presentation. She was so excited to express her faith and just her love and joy for her hero, Jesus. So my classroom after that, a lot of the students started to talk about Jesus. The fact that they were able to talk about their faith in the classroom so openly, I saw that their behavior became much better. So the next years, the other teachers were encouraged to allow students to speak about their faith in the classroom. One of the amazing results of the project was students started bringing their Bibles to school, and they still do today. Gateways to Better Education really empowered me on how I could help my students live out their faith in the classroom.
Imagine teachers like Shirley in your schools empowering students like Olivia. Imagine people in your schools seeing the opportunities all around them. What if Christians saw each other as members of the body of Christ on campus, each having something to contribute? What if parents helped their children be discerning about what they're learning? What if educators taught students the good that the Bible and Christianity brings to the world? What if school board members and administrators made sure their schools protected religious freedom and adopted curriculum that supported faith, family, and freedom? And what if students expressed their faith at school in homework, class discussions, and in sharing the gospel with friends? What a difference we could make together in our public schools. Gateways to Better Education has launched the National Free to Speak campaign to promote freedom of religious expression in schools. The campaign uses short videos and printed materials for students and educators. It provides faculty training on students' religious freedoms. It also helps educators understand how to confidently teach about the Bible and Christianity within constitutional boundaries. It helps school boards adopt a policy that protects and promotes religious freedom in schools. And it equips parents to help their children navigate the public schools so they graduate with their faith and values intact and even stronger. To realize this vision, we need you to help make it happen. Join with your brothers and sisters who are already in your schools and make a lasting impact on the lives of students.
By the way, that teacher Shirley and her student Olivia are here in Orange County. So, it happens. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time here, the National Free to Speak campaign comes in 4 steps. The first step is figuring out where are the Christians in our schools, and we have a strategy for that. Secondly, we then train them on all that they can do, and we do that virtually. We're going to do that here in California in October. We motivate them then throughout the year. We stay in contact with them. We do webinars and Zoom calls and emails, and we're working with Alliance Defending Freedom. When it comes into a community and it's working in that community, We give them the names and addresses of every school official in the community. ADF then sends them a 6-page letter personalized to that school official, letting them know, here's what students' religious liberties are, here's what teachers' religious freedoms are. It's always nice to have them know that a legal organization is watching. And then at the end of the year, we want that local community to have a gathering time, and this is where other campus ministries can get involved, because we want them to help MC it. And this is where Christians can, hey, if you had a music teacher who did a great Christmas program and used religious Christmas carols, you can't take that for granted anymore. So thank her, honor her, celebrate her. And then it's a great place for the preschool moms who don't know anything about the school to gather with the elementary moms who've already been there. Hey, let me share with you what's going on in our school. Here's the lay of the land, and so forth. And the junior high parents matching up with the high school parents. It's a wonderful way for the body of Christ to work together. We've got every Wednesday in October here for California, and it's customized for California law and California academic standards. Every Wednesday, October 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th, from 7 to 8 p.m. Hey, you watch TV for an hour, be a part of this webinar for an hour, it'll change your life. And share this with friends. So what do? If you go into our table in the back, we have a simple form, and you start brainstorming on who are the Christians I know in the schools, their names, their school they're involved in, whether they're a parent or a teacher, their phone numbers, their email address. Now, you don't give that to us. We're not wanting to get people's emails. They get an email from us, they don't know us, it's going to go in their junk. But what you do is you're thinking strategically. If you're at a church and you say, look, I'm going to have a table out in the church foyer, and the pastor's going to make an announcement about this, and I'm going to ask for anybody involved in a public school to come in and give us their information. Then we email it to you, or we email it to the church, or we email it to the director of your local campus ministry. They then forward that email to these contacts. So here's like Jim and Sarah Johnson, and they're at Live Oak Elementary. Parents, here's their phone number, here's their email address. Then when we send an email to you or your church or your school ministry, you then send it on to Sarah and Jim because they know you. And then we ask them also, forward this to the people you know in your school. Parents, teachers, and principal, maybe a school board member. There are Christians throughout the system. And so maybe they have 5 people they know. Now look at these numbers. Average of 20 people in your church or your school ministry that are involved in public schools. Times they forward it to 5 of their friends. That's now 100 people who will know about this October training. Multiply that times 50 churches or ministries. 5,000 people in California can be trained on stuff they never knew they could do. I'm telling you, this can really empower the body of Christ within schools. Will it solve all the problems? No. But let's get the people who are already there to start lifting the weight where they can, and they can make a big difference in students' lives. So again, every Wednesday, October 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th, from 7 to 8 p.m. So make sure you go out in the back and you get the flyer that links to the Department of Education, the Orange County Department of Education's videos. Get that form that you can fill out to identify who are the Christians you know in the public schools. You could do that through your church or ministry or just your own personal stuff. And other information out there. Be happy to help you answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Eric. Well, we finally arrived at the point in our evening where you get a break. Are you ready for one? Okay. Please don't take any longer than 10 minutes. We'll probably give a chime or something to herald you back because we're going to have a panel discussion. And I don't know, Angel, if we can put that slide back on that gives the phone number in case you didn't capture it. If you're thinking you have a question for our speakers tonight, now is the time to assemble them and text it to that phone number. So we'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. So it's this.
10 minutes behind?
Yeah, about 10.
Okay.
It's not that bad. Not bad. So it's the same 7 points we usually talk about, but I added run for school board, so that's another one. Oh, you saw it. I sent it to you.
In Dropbox.
Yes. So you looked through it?
Yeah.
Okay. Good deal. All right.
Are we all done with the laptop presentation? Do you have any?
No, we've got more.
Okay, because we're gonna start the panel discussion. I'm gonna put two 6-foot tables out on the cross.
That's great.
Here.
Fantastic.
But
You
it
can just
might
leave
be
the
in
laptop where it is. Well, we're gonna need it. We're gonna need it again
Okay.
because we have a summary after the panel discussion.
Put the tables on each side, one on each side.
That's
of
fine.
the podium.
What you
Yeah,
wanna
that's
do?
fine. Yeah, I wouldn't touch the
Okay,
podium.
how many speakers are we going to have up there?
It's just 3 and myself, so it's just 4 people. So if you want to do 2 and 2, or we can even put it on the side if you want to.
Just one table with
3 people, and then I'll be at the podium asking the question. Yes,
Okay.
that would
So-
work.
Sure.
Yeah, let's do that.
We'll do it that way.
close up to the front
We'll put
so
it to
people
the
can
front
see
and
it.
Perfect.
on both sides.
Perfect. How's it going? Good.
Yeah, or do this, you email this and then email me your email. Send me your email and send it to me. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, please do. That way you're
Does it have to be in caps or does it
all
matter?
caps.
Oh my gosh.
Didn't go in. Marie, events, after kids done, and then try, just don't put the pound sign. I couldn't remember if it was with or without the pound sign. It's not going in.
Doesn't like that. I might have to take your laptop.
That's totally fine. We've got 23 questions.
So how do I get to them?
So we've gotten, it's a
Do you
couple.
just scroll up?
Yeah, scroll up, and there's 16 new ones coming in. We've got a total of 25 in there that have
Okay.
come. I've deleted a few, but we can go right here. So they've all
So it's
come up.
easy, so I can just scroll up and down
Yeah.
to see the questions.
Yep. Should be.
Use the trackpad?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. That's
There
what
you
I
go.
need. Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you,
Okay.
Marie. I'm going to take your laptop.
ahead.
Is it charged up enough?
Yep. Totally.
Okay. 9:30, 9:35. This is new technology, so bear with us. It looks like many of you were successful in asking questions. So here's the first one to our panel. Are private schools protected from the curriculums that we have discussed tonight? Who would like to take that?
Yeah, it depends on the private school, but they are not mandated to teach it. But of course, if they wanted to, they could. But that's the great thing about private schools is that they do not have to.
What I would also say is that you have to look at, private school has a lot of latitude. So if you're sending your child to some private academy, you want to go in and see what is their worldview behind what they're teaching. Because it could be worse. They could teach beyond whatever the law states. And we have evidence of private schools in California, in New York, going way above and beyond. Sometimes it's there before it even gets into the public schools because there's people of influence who are pushing this kind of curriculum. So you really have to watch out. You want to go in as a parent, meet with the principal and talk and ask them all of these questions. I would say even if it's labeled as a Christian private school, go in there and meet with the principal and ask the tough questions, especially today as it relates to CRT. And I've had to do that with mine. 2 of my kids go to a Christian private school. And so I went in unabashedly and I asked all of my questions, and I wanted to make sure that even from a doctrinal standpoint that we align. So parents, please be on the lookout even with private schools.
Do grandparents have any rights to affect what's happening with their grandkids in the public schools?
Yeah, absolutely. All of the rights that I talked about it's not just limited to parents. Grandparents can do that as well. And I can't think of anything that the grandparents can't do. Of course, maybe if, the parents tell the school, hey, don't let this grandparent do it. But besides that, I mean, if it's your family unit that can really help direct the upbringing of these kids. So, and I think they do have a big role. A lot of times parents, I know being a mom of 2 young kids, I don't necessarily have all the time for things. So really I rely a lot on my in-laws, and they're helpful in so many ways, and it takes a village to raise a child. So grandparents absolutely, not only can you, but I think you have an obligation to.
I'm calling on all the army of grandparents out there to come and help us. Help us parents. And I see you guys out there, and I really appreciate you being here because it's tough being a parent today. I'm sure it was a tough being a parent during your time as well. But here are the challenges we are faced with. God has put us here during this time, and He sure has equipped us with the tools to be able to stand up to the challenge. So thank you, grandparents.
How can I find out what my school is teaching in regard to these 3 topics?
Yeah, you can start by going to the teacher themselves or the district office, and particularly be armed with the code that says you can review the curriculum, that there needs to be a streamlined process to make it easy for parents to review the curriculum. And go in there. Sometimes they'll make it difficult for you. They'll say you have to make an appointment, and it's these obscure hours, and only on certain days. But it's, you advocate for yourself, and if they really make it difficult, then that's where those legal codes come in handy, and a lawyer can write a letter. There are several letters already drafted on this topic. You just change the name of the school, and you send it to them that outlines their obligation, and they have to allow you to do that. But usually, like for my district, I'm in Riverside County, but I had to go to the school district itself, and I had to sit in a conference room with, I think because they knew I was a lawyer, so they were like the superintendent, the assistant superintendent watching me, go through the binders. But I'm just like, I just want to look at your curriculum. Why is it such a big deal? But yeah, it's different for every school district.
So every school district typically has in their organizational structure something called the Office of Curriculum. So if you go on your school district's website, look up the organizational chart, Office of Curriculum, and the name of the person in that box is the name that you want to email or call. They usually have a secretary, so that manages their calendar and their schedule. So call them up, set up an appointment, and then from there you can ask all of your questions. Usually the Office of Curriculum, whoever leads that, is usually like one step beneath the superintendent, because there's many like assistant superintendents. So that's where I would start, and they'll usually answer all your questions, but in a very like over-the-shoulder manner, because that's the same thing that happened to me.
Okay, good. I didn't know if it was just me.
So some of the material that you showed tonight looks like cartoon child pornography. Aren't there laws on the books prohibiting child pornography being distributed to children?
Yes, there are laws on the books, but there's an exception for the educational context. So, if I were to send that same thing, give you that same image, let's say just randomly someone in a Target parking lot, that's child pornography. If you give the same thing to a kid in an educational setting, that's an exception to the criminal, to the obscenity laws. So that's the thing, is this, it's educational, therefore it's not child porn, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, the other thing I want to talk a lot about is the forces behind this. The obscenity laws didn't allow for that before. They were changed, I believe, in the early 70s. So who changed them? Again, it was the Planned Parenthood SIECUS-driven influence to change these laws to be able then to bring in this kind of sex education curricula into the public school district. So they knew they had to overturn that and change that law. So again, it's demonically evil in how well they have attacked the structure of the laws of this nation.
If memory serves, I think the case George is talking about is Miller versus California, and it goes back to 1972, somewhere right in there. As part of the public school system, are charter schools prohibited from allowing homeschool parents from using Christian curriculums? Are they, charter schools, prohibited from allowing school funds to be used to purchase Christian curriculums for parents to use at home?
Anyone else want that? That's a very good question. So it definitely depends on the particular circumstances, not to give a lawyer answer. But there are a lot of things that parents can do in the charter school, like the hybrid homeschool as well. So, really just depends. I don't know. Anyone have a better, more solid answer?
Just a comment on the charter schools. So they do have a bit more freedom than the normal run-of-the-mill public schools. They're not quite as accountable to the local school district, so they do have some freedom. But in regards to state laws, in terms of curriculums and what they teach, by law, they're supposed to teach it. In fact, there was a special law, I think it was 2601, that was passed under Governor Brown that requires charter schools now to teach comprehensive sexuality education. So just bear that in mind. And not all charter schools are the same. In fact, there are some good ones and there are some not so good ones. One wonderful example of a charter school is Classical Academy right in George's backyard in the city of Orange, who follow a classical, oh, you're aware of it. And Hillsdale College is working with parents to start charter schools across the country that teach the Hillsdale model curriculum. So if you've got fire in the belly and you can't afford to send your child to a private school or homeschool them, contact Hillsdale College and start a charter school in your local neighborhood.
One more thing. Aren't there Christian-based curriculum that teach from a faith-based perspective the sexuality education? I can't think of the names off the top of my head, but there are two where, so let's say you're a charter hybrid homeschool, you can meet the requirements of the California Healthy Youth Act with a curriculum that we can all agree on. Like I said, I mean, we're not required to teach all that disgusting stuff. And so two were intentionally made from I believe, a faith-based perspective, and cover everything that they need to cover under sex ed curriculum. And they can also come into public schools because they do satisfy all the criteria. And so, if there are parents involved, they can advocate for this program to come in, because Planned Parenthood's doing that. They're going into schools. So you do have organizations on the other side that are doing that as well. Qualified teachers that have written curricula that they can bring into schools. What are the two?
Check the Facts, that's one of them, and then HEART, H-E-A-R-T, it's an acronym. So when you search for it online, just type in capital H.E.E.A.R.T.
And you can also go through that alone with your kids or grandkids. Look at it, use it. We do want to educate them about these things. We're not saying, cover their ears and make it seem like, LGBTQ doesn't exist or sex isn't pleasurable or whatnot. There's not temptation. You can use those as tools for yourself, your grandkids, your neighbors, whatever. Give it to them. Make it in the educational context. You won't have to worry about child pornography because these are solid and educational.
If you go to protectourkidsnow.org, our website, and go to the menu page and go down to parents, you'll find tons of resources there to help you navigate through these curriculums and laws. And both the Check the Facts and HEART curriculums are featured there. So you can certainly talk to your school administrators and convince them. We know you have to teach CSE if it's a middle school or high school, but you can convince them, choose the least offensive curriculum. And these are two good examples of the least offensive. Is it better to opt out of sex ed or just keep our kids at home on those days? I know that schools are impacted financially when we keep our kids home. Is this a good way to show them that we don't agree with their curriculum?
Yeah, I know that there have been stay-at-home days to basically protest, and schools do lose a lot of money, so that's one way to make a statement. And if you know the dates that certain things are going to be taught, you just want to keep your kid home because you want to avoid them, going into another classroom or even just being singled out. Those are real issues, particularly for middle school, high school. You don't want to be the one that's, you have to leave while we talk about the good stuff. And so it's an option to keep them home and use one of the curricula that you'll find on the website and go through them yourself, or just have a fun day. Go have fun with your kids and grandkids.
You can also do a religious accommodation excuse, in that if your church, for instance, knows this is going to be dealt with in this week or this day, and they say, okay, then our youth group is going to do an event at our church that day, then the school has to allow for that religious accommodation for them to leave. If they allow for students to leave for other reasons, doctor's appointments or whatever it might be, they can't discriminate. So you say, yeah, they've got a church event they've got to go to. And so then it's not docked against them for being excused.
Yeah, that's good.
Are the teachers for comprehensive sexuality education brought in from an outside organization, or do the assigned school teachers teach the material?
So they can bring them in, and a lot of them do, and Planned Parenthood is more than willing and advertises that it does that, and that's what they want. They really want the captive audience of these kids young. They're their future customers, so they have a vested financial interest in getting in there. So the law, as you saw, allows for someone on the outside to come in and teach it, and it really is up to the school. But they have to, in that 14-day prior notice, let you know if that's going to happen. If Planned Parenthood's coming, they have to tell you, this is the organization that will be teaching this to your kid. But I think for the most part, it's teachers, health teachers that teach it. But it is an option to have someone from the outside come in.
We've been talking over here about another option too, and that is there's an organization called Beacon of Light with Amber Auger, and she can come in as a guest speaker. So if you have Planned Parenthood come in, she can come in, and she comes in from a much more conservative Christian worldview approach to it. And so you could look her up, Beacon of Light.
Yeah, and I believe she has been, Amber Auger has been into public schools in Orange County, so it is not unheard of, and, you know, maybe she's been at the particular school that your child or grandchild goes to.
My kids are in 6th and 7th grade. They come home from school telling me about teachers who rant their political opinions and openly shame anyone who is a Republican or conservative. How can I address this? Shouldn't teachers be unbiased and teach the academic material without injecting their personal views? Also, they watch CNN at school. Okay, that's a loaded one. Who wants to take it?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm sure maybe we'll all address it, but so the equal protection law that you can't be discriminated against. So if in that rant she's discriminating against your religion or your race or sexual orientation, that is a violation of the law. So there's a lot of anti-discrimination laws. The ones that they try to use to bring in some of this nonsense are the same ones that actually protect, you know, faith-based and heterosexual sexual orientation that's protected as well. You know, the protection against sexual orientation discrimination isn't just for LGBTQ, it's also for heterosexuals as well. So I'll say that. I mean, there are tons of laws against discrimination. And so a matter of bringing the complaint, you know, having that evidence, whether it's writing it down, what she's saying, or if there's a handout, a flyer, and holding them accountable.
Yeah, and we encourage parents to use a 3-step strategy when talking to a teacher about a concern, and we raised 3 daughters through the public schools and use this ourselves. It works. It's a gracious way to approach the issue, and that is you start with, help me understand. You know, my daughter came home and she said that this went on in class. I just want to clarify, because sometimes, you know, they get it wrong, they perceive it wrong. Help me understand what you said about this, and you're not trying to trap them, you're actually trying to clarify, did I get it right? And did this, I want to understand what was going on there. And then once you understand that, then find a point of agreement. Hey, well, I really appreciate you want the students to think critically about politics and that sort of, that's great, I really appreciate that. But have you considered you're really marginalizing, and that's a good term to use with our liberal friends, you're really marginalizing a lot of students who don't hold to that view and making them feel like less than because of their views on that. And this really makes them very uncomfortable. It's kind of an uncomfortable learning environment, don't you think? And you actually start to have a dialogue. We call it relational activism. You know, obviously, time and a place for politics, time and a place for legal action, but it's those Monday through Friday kind of conversations that you can have, and it might not always win the day, but at least it's a place to start. You know, I like to say we're called to be salt and light, but you know, we use salt on things to make it better, not bitter, and our light should be a lamp, not a blowtorch. And so you start with a relationship, you know, and now it doesn't always work, and you might have to elevate it, but start there, because we've seen that successfully done. Oh, we had that with our daughter on a situation where the teacher was very vocal on her opinion about things and telling the students, I don't even want to hear your opinion if it opposes this. And so we contacted the teacher and said, wow, you know, that sounds like the definition of bullying. And it really caught the teacher off guard. She was like, whoa, no, I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry, you know. And so it's just, again, one of those conversation starters.
The only thing I'll add, Mark, is just that I think this is such a great opportunity for parents, what Netta pointed out in her presentation on how to equip our children. Teach them the buzzwords. So that way, even though they might not have comprehended what was being said, you know, I've taught my older boys the buzzwords, so they'll come home and say, Dad, they used the word transgender today. So the first thing I do is I send a quick email to the teacher and say, something about transgenderism came up in class. Can you show me the slides you use or something like this? And sure enough, within 24 hours, the teacher will send it. And then boom, usually I uncover a bunch of other things that were said in that lesson. So then I send my markups to that PDF and I say, can you please help me understand how you taught these things and why they even belong in this lesson here? And so I've had multiple instances just this past school year where I've had to do that, then together with the teacher and the principal, come to an agreement how to revise that so all future lessons for future sixth graders will never have that ever again. So we have an impact not just on our children, but future children coming through that classroom. So parents, we have to do that.
Yeah, that's great.
So for the sake of time, 2 more questions. Annetta, this one's going to go to you because we have many questions on the same topic. And arguably, there is a 4th threat to children in our public schools, and that's forced vaccines in order for them to attend. So Netta, maybe you could talk to the law with regard to kids being required to have vaccines in the public schools, and is your law firm involved in students' rights in that regard?
Yes. So unfortunately, the legal precedent in public schools with vaccines, as you know, they've taken away the religious exemption and the philosophical exemption, and they have a whole litany of vaccines that are required. And, you know, unfortunately, the next one is very quickly going to be the COVID-19 vaccine, that your kid cannot go to school unless they have that vaccine. And in LAUSD, they have what's called the Microsoft Pass. And LAUSD, you know, sets the tone for other school districts. And there's been pilot districts in Orange County, I think, wanted to be like a vaccine passport, you know, things like that. That's going to be hitting schools. That's the next thing. And so it's, you know, don't be surprised, unfortunately. And the case law precedent is not in our favor. You know, it's been, you know, just etched away every time with each new vaccine and each new taking away of an exemption. And so the second part of the question, are we doing anything about that? So we do have a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit that we filed in LAUSD. They implemented the Microsoft Pass, and they don't, so as part of that pass, it's like testing mandates and contact tracing, and it's, you know, something that all the kids have to have on their phones. And so we started that lawsuit, we initiated it, we didn't wait for vaccines to be part of it because we knew they were going to use this Microsoft Pass, you know, to add vaccines once that becomes a school mandate. And I know there are other lawsuits as well throughout the state on masks, and you know, it's a new, as it relates to COVID, it's a new issue, but unfortunately with vaccines, it's historically with case precedent, it's so ingrained. I think what it's going to take is, so sad to say, but it's going to take an injury, you know, a very severe, clear case of someone who was forced to take it by, vaccine makers are obviously not liable, you know, they have full immunity and they're making billions of dollars. But let's say, you know, an employer or a school makes you take that vaccine, and that's the only reason that the kid took it, and there was a severe injury. That is a lawsuit, and it's sad that we're gonna have to wait for something like that to happen. But it's really going to take something like that. So legally, there's not much we can do about the COVID vaccine mandate in public schools. We're trying to fight it with the Microsoft Pass, with privacy and some of these other things that aren't directly, you know, against the vaccine mandate. But, you know, our voice is being heard, and politically it's a big issue. And so, although I think the legal avenue is pretty much, I wouldn't say it's completely hopeless, but there's very little hope that that's where we're going to win. And so it's really going to take advocacy and, you know, potentially, it's such a tough topic. I mean, that's all I've been getting inundated with is vaccine, just horror stories, people who have to, you know, college, because colleges, it's mandated right now. And so they are allowing religious exemptions with colleges. Some colleges don't even allow religious exemptions. We have one, our legal intern in his third year of law school, his medical exemption was denied and his religious exemptions denied. He already paid tuition. He's in his last year of law school. So it's just such a bleak outlook. But it really does take political advocacy and going to school districts, going to board meetings, just like parents have been doing with masks. When vaccines come around, please get a little bit of rest now, because we're gonna need you to knock on those doors and those mama bears and grandmama bears and dads and granddads to just cause a ruckus, because that's what it's gonna take. It's not something that I could win on the legal front. Sorry.
Well, that's all the time we have for our panel discussion. George and I are going to give a summary for this evening, but thank you, panel. Thank you for your wise wisdom. And if you have additional questions for them, Netta's already given you her email, so you can just contact her directly. I think for Eric, you can contact him through his website. And for POK, if you go to our website, protectourkidsnow.org, there's a Contact Us form. Feel free to pose any question you have at that form, and we will definitely get back to you. So can we go back to our slide deck? Perfect. Okay, whenever we do these conferences or have speaking engagements, this is the question. What can we do? What can I do now that you've heard this information? Well, the first thing you can do is what you've already started to do tonight. Once you've gotten informed, you can get engaged. We do advise you to go to our website. We have tons of material there, and we're adding to it all the time. And that material is in terms of the law, parents' rights, students' rights. We have short PragerU kinds of videos that you can look at. These are typically 5 to 10 minutes long. In fact, we just published our most recent one, What is Critical Race Theory, that was done by pastor and attorney Mark T. Little. It's very powerful. So if you want to learn more about the topics that we've described tonight, this is a great source of information, but you don't have to stop there. There are many other organizations that are linked to our website that you can peruse and visit, and you will find out all you want to know and probably more about these topics. And then once you're informed, get engaged. If all of you stand up tonight and go home and tell yourselves, well, that was terrible. What are we going to do about this? And that's where it ends, not much will change. You have to become activists in your local community. You have to take action.
Number 2 is get out now. And we don't say this lightly, and I don't say this lightly as a parent either, because this is a tough message to send, right? George, are you saying that it is hopeless? So there was a book that I got to read a couple of years ago, because I wasn't convinced either this was the right option to take. And these 2 moms that wrote it basically gave a history of all of the tactics and strategies that have been tried to recover the public education system. And they've all miserably failed. Basically, we've reached a point where you have to ask yourself the question pretty seriously: is public education redeemable? And it's a very challenging question to be able to answer with an affirmative yes by keeping your kids there. The very thought-provocative quote towards the end of this book says this: we send evangelists to cannibals, we don't feed them our children. The evangelists are the teachers, are the adults, are the ones that have already have a solid faith in Jesus Christ and can go there and become evangelists. Our children are not necessarily equipped to be able to withstand the psychological warfare that's going on. And I speak as a father of 4 very tough and challenging decisions to make. But this is by far the best thing that you could do for your kids. Now, we understand that most parents probably can't because number one reason is economical. That's where you have to be praying for your kids. You have to be praying over your kids. You have to be praying over your kids. That's what it takes in daily instructing them, as Pastor Bob mentioned early on. They're that arrow, and it takes the skillful warrior to shape and mold and project and put the right trajectory on it. So please, parents, we encourage you to do this. Now, the number one reason why, besides the children and their protection, is because children are a dollar sign for the other side. They're $15,000 a year. Remember the video with David Schmooth saying teachers are paying about $1,100 a year? If you think that puts a dent in the teachers' union, think of one child. It puts the dent of 15 teachers in against their dollar amounts. So they are dollar signs. So for these two reasons, consider getting out now.
Number 3, opt out. So we've talked about this tonight. You do have legal rights to opt out specifically of comprehensive sexuality education. Please take the time to do this. And this applies across K through 12. So as we mentioned, CSE is only by law required in middle school and high school, and it's 10 hours of instruction in middle school and high school. Opt out of that. Elementary schools have the discretion to teach CSE, and unfortunately, many are. You have the right to find out if they are. So regardless, don't take the chance. Go to our website or one of many others, download the forms, and make sure you get your children out of what you can. Now, that only applies to comprehensive sex ed. Critical race theory right now is not required instruction. It may soon be. There is a law pending in the state legislature right now, I think it's Assembly Bill 101, that will, if it's passed, it will make critical race theory a requirement to graduate from high school. And from there, it'll just funnel down to the lower grades. So you don't have the right to opt your children out of something that isn't by law being taught, but you certainly need to in the areas that you can opt them out. So please do that.
Number 4 is vote. So I want to put this in perspective for probably most of you that maybe were born and raised here. We didn't get this amazing privilege in Romania to vote. It was a communist regime, totalitarian in nature. The way that the civic structure has been set up for America from its founding was giving we the people the authority and the responsibility to get involved civically. And so please, we encourage you to vote and to also vote intelligently because a lot of times people just go out and vote for whoever has the name recognition. Please understand what they truly stand for. Even when it comes down to school board members, a lot of times we could be deceived even by people who we think are going to stand up for our rights. And we have a very similar situation happening in one of our school districts here in Orange County. But it's so important to get engaged by voting. And if you need information on how to vote, our friends at California Family Council, they put out a lot of great information, but they also do, besides voting, they also help you understand the laws and the bills that are actually going through the state legislature. And they basically package them down and say, hey, look, here are the worst ones to watch. We need your help. So go on their website.
Number 5, run for school board. I see a lot of older faces out there, retired people who have time on their hands. Just as all politics is local, all education is local. George and I have very good friends who are trustees on the Orange County Department of Education. And they regularly hold symposiums or forums to talk about the issues that we've just discussed tonight. In fact, over the last couple of months, they've had subject matter experts come in and talk specifically about critical race theory. But they will tell you, they will openly admit that they personally don't have any power to affect what's actually taught in the local school district. That is a function of the local school district boards. And you can have an impact there. Yes, it will take time, effort, and work, but this is probably one of the single most practical areas that you can make an immediate difference running for school board. We plan on taking this on as a project and protect our kids in the future and providing education for actually how to do that. We already have a link on our website through the Leadership Institute that has a course right now. You can go to their site and take this course on how to run for school board. So I highly recommend, if you have time on your hands, inclination, don't be afraid, get out there, make a difference, run for school board.
So in America, education is monopolized by the public school system. So if we decentralize that, how do you do it? Well, that's something called school choice, and we encourage you to support school choice. What does this mean? So if in the state of California it costs about $15,000 per student out of our public taxpayer dollars, what happens if those dollars now are given to you as a parent for your child, for each one of your children, and then you get to cut a check out of that $15,000 and say, look, I really want my son or daughter to go to this school here because I think this one does a better job at educating them. And oh, by the way, that will more than likely mean private school. And usually the private schools in elementary level here in this area are somewhere around $8,000 to $10,000. So then you get to keep the other $5,000, but still for education, right? So think about K through 8, you've just saved 8 times $5,000, all right, that's $40,000. Plus then, let's say high school, right? High school is a little more expensive, so you might be dipping into that 40 buffer, and you're probably finishing off high school with a good $20,000, $30,000 left in the bank to send them to college with. What if that would be possible? We are partnering with an organization called California School Choice Foundation. They are trying to put this up on the ballot for November 2022, so that way we, the people, can vote and say yes, and hopefully we get a majority so that then these monies come to our children directly and they won't continue funding the current corrupt public school system.
Number 7, speak up. Most parents, particularly conservatives, they just want to live their quiet lives. They're involved in their families and their vocations. They simply do not want to get involved. The other side, I hate to say it, but it's true, they derive their identity from being activists. We need to be activists. Deuteronomy 6 makes it very clear parents' responsibility to their children. Psalm 1 says we shouldn't have them sitting in the seat of scoffers. Please take the information you've heard tonight and share it with your family members, with your neighbors, with your peers, with your associates. One of my heroes is Dr. Martin Luther King. Of course, he was the founder and promoter of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And he said famously, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Our children matter. It's time to speak up on their behalf. Now, there's one other thing that we need to do besides these 7, and it's the most important thing that we can do. And that is pray. Because at the end of the day, this is really not a fight with our local school boards or with woke activists. This is a spiritual battle at its core, and it's been going on for a long, long time. Pastor Bob, I want to thank you personally for your willingness to host this event tonight. I want to thank you for attending. And at this time, I'm going to ask Pastor Bob to come up and close us in prayer.
I feel like tonight, I know it's been long, but thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. I think it was, the good, the bad, and the ugly is kind of what I felt. And I appreciate you, gentlemen, taking the time in your life. Yeah, I don't just mean to come tonight. The clear passion they have for our kids and our grandkids and for their children and their children's children and future generations. I think of Ezekiel being told, you're a watchman on the wall, and I'm going to hold you accountable for what you know. You got to sound the alarm. Gentlemen, you have done that tonight for us, and thank you. I appreciate that. But that same commitment, what he just shared, it comes down to us. We have children who have children, some of us, in the schools. They know nothing about what you just heard. And we're still trying to filter out and figure out everything we just heard. But we need to share the resources, the information, the concerns with those people that are being affected, our friends, our family, our neighbors. So the resources that they've given us, that they are themselves, please, please don't just say, this is horrible, I hope it all changes, I'm pulling my kids out. Some of you already homeschool your kids. By the way, our church has a homeschool ministry. We'd love to talk to those of you that are interested in that. By the way, this whole move in our state is affecting churches and Christians all over the place. We're seeing Christians rising up to say, yeah, I can't do that anymore. I really can't homeschool, but I can't afford even the Christian schools, and I'm not sending them back to public. There's got to be some other alternatives. So there are some things that are happening, and I pray they happen soon and locally for more and more people. But again, praise God for you guys, and thank you. Let's just stand, and I'm going to close this in prayer. Father, thank you for all the information, a little bit overwhelmed. And certainly, Lord, when we hear of the progress of evil in our state, it in one way just sickens us and it angers us. But I thank you, Lord, that you said, be angry, but sin not. And Lord, that you want us to have righteous indignation at evil in our culture and to stand against it as salt and light. Thank you for the loving and creative ways that our brother gave us tonight for engaging people that maybe don't agree with us, but Lord, that we want to be a positive influence on those people, the teachers, the educators, the faculty, the principals, superintendents, the school boards. Lord, we want to have a positive witness in our culture, and we want our kids to not just simply get through school without being destroyed. Lord, we want them to thrive. We want them to grow. And we want them, if they're in the school system, to be witnesses. So help us as parents to take the job you've called us to have, to bring our children up in the fear and we would be godly parents and grandparents. Help us, Lord. We need help. And we thank you for the help that you're giving us in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen. God bless you and have a good night. And thank you again.